Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Sacred Symbols Plus, a PlayStation podcast supplement. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined today by a very special guest, Rick Hoeg, virtual legality, Hoeg Law, of course, our legal analyst here on Last Stand Media, occasional Constellation guest now, etc., and so on, getting him more into the fold. Thrilled to have you here, Hoeg. How are you today, my friend?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here. We got a lot to talk about.
We do. I wanted to do an episode with you for a while, and I felt like there was a confluence of topics that we could cover, like we have in the past. Things that I don't think quite fit well on Sacred Symbols itself, but things that I want to talk about nonetheless in our sphere. I have to tell you, this, I think, is the 400th episode of Sacred Symbols Plus, just coincidentally. We don't really celebrate, these nice round hundreds for Sacred Symbols Plus because they're kind of this more ephemeral content, but that's a lot of shows.
I've been on a lot of shows. I'm happy to be ephemeral.
Yeah, me too. Well, we all are in the grand scheme of things, universally, aren't we? So everything going on well in your life? Things are good?
Yeah, we're still figuring out, getting the law firm back up and running, doing a few more videos now, trying to get back to normal speed for me. But yeah, it's been a good year. I can't complain.
Yeah, when you had your illness, I guess you're kind of on your own, right? Like you don't have a partner or paralegal or anyone working for you, right?
When I left to start the firm, I left with a partner.
Right.
But it quickly became apparent that wasn't going to work out in the long term, which is fine. He's a great guy.
Oh, yeah. You told me that recently. Yeah. He just didn't want to do it. Yeah.
It just wasn't the right fit. And to some extent, you don't know that until you take the leap, folks, for anything, whether you're starting a law firm or doing anything else. So I always recommend folks to give it a try because you can reverse course. You can always take a different direction, as my partner did. And then Hoeg Law launched from there because it was just me. But I do have contractual relationships with things like paralegals and filing services and whatnot. But my goal was to not have to have the same amount of overhead that I was seeing at the big law firm level, that I could offer hopefully better, cheaper packages for what I like to work with, which is entrepreneurs and small businesses, because to some extent, large legal fees kind of crush those dreams in the crib before they get out there and start to grow. So that was the idea. So when I had my stroke, I did not have anybody under my employment. I did have a deal that I was closing at the time, which got taken care of essentially because my wife found my old partner to go and help figure it out for my clients. And all my clients have been great about all of that. So I can't complain about my vendors, my clients. Anyone else has contacted me and said, we're going to help you out. We're going to make it happen. You did too, Colin. You came out of the woodwork and said, we can help with the channel. And like everybody's been so awesome. I can't complain at all.
Cool, man. Well, it's good. I personally, and I'm sure you do too, especially because you're so into M&A, and we'll get into that on this show, but I love to learn the way businesses work. I'm just fascinated by how people do their thing. So I always ask weird probing questions about people's businesses, big and small. But if I recall correctly, your firm's kind of tag was something like big law firm, attention, little law firm. I don't know.
Big law. Yeah. I mean, I change that up every once in a while. Yeah. So there's like 6 versions of it, but it's big law firm expertise with a small law firm feel.
Right. That's what it is. Yeah.
So
a lot better than what I was saying.
That was the idea when I started the firm. I didn't want to be, though, the exact same version of my old firm, but smaller. And so that has been a part of the growth curve for Hoeg Law, which started, I think, in a similar time frame to you in 2016. And certainly some of the other kind of content creators in the space. And it's been fun to watch the whole kind of industry grow up and become as popular as it has.
Cool. I'm glad to be here with you today because I feel like we were recording quite a bit together. We had so much stuff to do with like the Activision deal and all the rest. We were just constantly meeting about these things. And I think some of the audience was getting tired of it, but I kind of loved that shit. Like the in the weeds, going through the documents, the court leaks, and we know so little about these. Yeah,
I'm never going to begrudge anybody getting sick of seeing me. That's fine. I get that. But yeah, we were doing all the deals and all of the business stuff. And I think I was even on Sacred Symbols Plus once before, where we were like, well, this is like your third and 5 videos. And so we're going to try not to have you for every little thing that changes in these. And then they kind of went away for a little while.
Right.
So I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I feel like, again, there's a confluence of things for us to discuss with your expertise and the things that I think you and I both like about the industry, or talking about the industry, and some drama and all the rest. So basically, this is what happened. I emailed Hoeg and I was like, listen, I'd love to have you on the show, 2 hours or so. We'll see how long we go. I have 4 topics. I actually added a 5th, but we kind of merged 2 of them at Hoeg's suggestion. So here's what we're going to talk about today. You'll probably see it in the title and the description as well. But I want to talk about Krafton's acquisition of Tango Gameworks. This is obviously very much in your wheelhouse, and I want to specifically talk about how these deals come together after the fact, and what might have been happening behind the scenes. We obviously don't know for sure, but I think it'll be fun to kind of speculate. I want to talk about and a lot of people are written about this topic, and I feel bad ignoring you. I just don't think it's appropriate for the Sacred Symbols audience, but the situation at Second Wind, a competitor of ours, but I'm friendly with those guys. I have no problem with them at all. And a lot of people reached out about this, being like, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And we'll get into all of that. And we'll get into all of it. And I didn't even tell Hoeg this. I talked to Nick Calandra on the record, and I have a bunch of comments from him about the different things that were claimed. So we'll get into that and run that through. And then I think we're going to merge these next 2 together. I wanted to talk about the shutting down of the MW2 multiplayer mod for Call of Duty, specifically because I'm just confused why people even bother doing this stuff. And then I think we'll merge that with the Black Myth Wukong reviewer and streamer guide situation, right? Those are the 2 you wanted to put together. I'm really interested in that too. I did some digging about that as well, and I have a bunch of stuff to say about that. So on some level, a mountain out of a molehill. On another level, totally actually did happen. So we could talk about that. And then finally, I want to talk about SAG-Aftra and they're striking over AI concerns in the games industry and how we think that might go. So that seems like a reasonable, to use your parlance, docket of things to go
that
through.
is my parlance.
Yeah.
It's a good docket.
It's a fine docket. All right.
It's a full red rope of materials.
So let's start with the Krafton situation in Tango, and here's what people need to know. Krafton's a somewhat new, actually, South Korean company. But they're the guys that own PUBG. They also own the studio that did like Subnautica, and they own Striking Distance, which did Callisto Protocol and all the rest. And they've been kind of making some strategic purchases. They're becoming kind of a major player in South Korean core gaming, which is cool because there's a lot of obviously mobile gaming and PC gaming in Korea, but not so much on the console side. And on the other hand, so something that seemed totally unassociated to it, Tango Gameworks, which was owned actually Tango was founded and then quickly purchased by Bethesda, and ZeniMax owned them, I think, beginning in 2010. And then in 2018, Microsoft buys Bethesda, so they fall under kind of Xbox. They continue to make their games. They recently make Ghostwire Tokyo and then Hi-Fi Rush, and they're closed down a few months ago in Japan, Microsoft's kind of only Japanese footprint. This studio is revived by Krafton and comes under their ownership with the Hi-Fi Rush IP strictly, not the other IP that they would have worked on and owned, which stay with Microsoft. And the team will go on to support Hi-Fi Rush with a sequel and potentially a new different game as well. I thought this was fascinating because I just kind of thought this was a done deal. And I was thinking about you when it happened because I know, again, this is kind of in your space. What did you think? Did you have any high-level thoughts about this deal when you heard it go through? Because I was pleasantly surprised, but a little surprised because it seemed like it was kind of over.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good news for anybody that liked the Tango output. It was a surprise to me in that it was finished, right? One of the things that I have said in other venues is that when you want to sell a company, you want to sell it as an operational entity. That's how you're going to get your most bang for your buck, right? That it's functional, it's doing whatever it's doing, and you're going to get the best price for it selling it that way. It looks to me, and again, we're speculating because I'm not in the room and I didn't have these conversations. I don't have Phil on the horn. It looks to me like Microsoft didn't necessarily try to shop Tango, and probably were surprised to get a call from Krafton and maybe others after the fact to see if they were interested in selling the assets. But this is not an ideal situation for Microsoft because, as you might have seen in other news articles, they closed this studio like fully. They closed it and sold it for parts in terms of like their capital, their furniture and their computers and what have you, a couple months ago. So the people that were let go had to go and find another way to live. And so there are a lot of people at Tango that weren't necessarily at Tango by the time that Krafton comes swooping in. So this is not ideal for Microsoft. It's not even ideal for Krafton, but it is better than it just dissolving into the ether. So I think it's a positive story. From my perspective, you don't see it very often because in general, if somebody's got a saleable asset, they're going and trying to market it at the time. And something like Krafton being interested in that asset would have come out as part of that potential sales process. So I don't know what happened at Microsoft. I don't know when Krafton decided to make that call, but it seemingly is after they close it down, they say, hey, actually, we'd like to take that off your hands. It does seem like Krafton is most interested in Hi-Fi Rush, which is interesting because it only has one game in its library. And part of the story that I thought was the most interesting is they didn't get all of the Tango IP, right? They just got Hi-Fi Rush. So the rest of whatever Tango made, which I think is like Evil Within and Ghostwire, stays presumably with Microsoft. And that's not the normal way these things are sold. When you're buying a company, generally speaking, you buy all the intellectual property associated with the company. You buy the employee contracts, and you have an operational entity when you're done purchasing it. That's exactly what Microsoft bought with Activision and Bethesda ZeniMax, but not in this case. So it looks more like a hiring initiative to me than a full company coming over. It looks more like this was a seemingly cost-effective way for Krafton to bring in a lot of developers that they otherwise had a relationship with or liked for some reason or another, and the Hi-Fi Rush IP that they think is saleable either in Korea or worldwide.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's funny you say a few things that are worth pulling at there. I was thinking specifically about the Embracer deal with Crystal Dynamics, where that studio kind of would have been worthless without Tomb Raider and some of the things that came along with it. So you would have thought maybe Evil Within and the others would have gone with it. But I with Tango, but I think Evil Within's not really valuable. And I was wondering if it was possible that they were like, well, you cut off. Maybe that was part of the package, and they were like, well, maybe we can shave this cost down a little bit. We don't really want Ghostwire Tokyo. I like Ghostwire Tokyo, but there's no future for that IP. So it's like, who gives a shit, So I wonder if that had something to do with it too. And I do wonder if Hi-Fi Rush does have a future. I mean, they think it does, obviously. I wanted to ask you this specific question though, if and you seem to have kind of answered this because I had never seen the stories that they were kind of selling all their stuff off and closed them down. I was wondering if there was some sort of European style consultancy in Japan and Japanese business law. Not that we're experts in that field, or I expect you to be, but in other words, like where there's these periods that happen with London studio and Sony's family where they kind of announce the closure of the studio and then they're closed like 6 months later. And as I understand, that's to kind of like give people an opportunity to figure things out, maybe court a buyer, reorganize debt, do whatever's necessary to try to save these jobs. But it seems more like a formality than anything else. And then it comes back up and people are like, oh, London studio closed. And I'm like, we really closed 6 months ago. So I guess what I was saying is I was wondering if that happened with Tango, where they kind of were still a unit in some sense. And at the 11th hour, they were saved because of some sort of consultancy law in Japan or whatever. I just didn't know if that's what happened.
And of course, with the disclaimer that I'm an American lawyer and not a European or a Japanese lawyer, I still know enough to be dangerous on some of this stuff. Europe has some specific notification laws, very similar to the American WARN Act. You might be familiar with WARN, which is California, right? It is primarily California, but it is extended to other jurisdictions in the United States. And it's usually 90 days. There are different rules in different jurisdictions. And one of the ones that comes up is you don't really have that same obligation if you're closing the entire quote unquote plant, which is a weird way of thinking about video game creation. But if you cut down on a whole branch or a whole office like Tango, that's closing down a plant, which is different than laying off, than shaving employees from a specific kind of aspect of things. And different laws will have different rules for that. Europe has some of the strongest kind of notification requirements on that side of things. I don't think Japan as a law would have come in here on that score. I can't be sure. What I do know is that there are articles that showed like the Tango employees having a final pizza party and essentially turning the lights off in the studio space. So I think Tango was really shut down, like in a physical reality sense, not just a legal one, for some period of time. Because I do think that other people found other jobs and are not moving over to Krafton as part of this because of that kind of time frame between when Microsoft shut them down and moving forward with Krafton, which isn't ideal for anyone. except maybe the employees that found a different job that are happier potentially with their new employer than they would have been moving over to Krafton. But sometimes this stuff just works out that way. The real interesting question to me is, did Microsoft want to sell Tango? Did they know there was any interest potentially in an acquirer in Tango as moving forward as an operational entity? Or did they just close it on the assumption that there was no one out there that would potentially want to buy it, which is not usually how big companies like Microsoft operate. Generally speaking, there's always a strategic investment person working at these companies, fielding phone calls, potentially making phone calls for how everybody values everything in their portfolio. And I am most familiar with that from the American car companies and their strategic investment platforms because I'm in Southeast Michigan. But every big company has those kinds of phone calls all the time. So it's a little bit weird that this kind of quote unquote slipped through the cracks if Krafton had this value proposition for Tango Gameworks. But it is also possible, as you suggest, from them kind of slicing the intellectual property pie, that they didn't want an operational asset. And they wouldn't have been interested in that call when it came in then, or that they changed their minds after the fact themselves. So it's impossible for us out here to lay blame, if we wanted to, on any particular party of this story. But it is an odd kind of circumstance because usually it's better to get this done before you close the studio.
From an operational perspective, I wasn't very confused why they would close Tango if they were looking to truncate their studios. Because when you think about Bethesda's family, for instance, it's like, who else? And this is what I was saying at the time. I'm like, well, who else? If like you were to take another team, like who would go? You wouldn't get rid of the Elder Scrolls Online guys. You wouldn't get rid of Machine Games. You wouldn't get rid of id, and so on and so forth. So it's a bummer because it is like a strong team. Bethesda's first party, I actually think is quite strong per capita, but it's like the lowest performer kind of has to go. I found it somewhat ironic though, because of how much they were touting the success of Hi-Fi Rush and how I felt like Hi-Fi Rush was earnestly and honestly something new and exciting that they really could have built on. It was very strange. I don't think they did that game. Listen, I love the idea of like surprise releases and really short preview cycles and all of the rest, but I'm not sure that did a lot of favors for that game specifically. Yet they toted millions of players. I bought it when it came to PlayStation. I have not played it yet. I really liked Pentiment, but that's obviously not a huge, like similar kind of small game that they were investing in that's not going to do well. I feel like Hi-Fi Rush had a lot of potential, but I also just feel like, well, who else is going to go? If you have the nip and tuck, this is kind of the
Tango is primarily a victim of timing, right? I mean, they were the ones that had just completed a project most recently. And even if that project was well received, which is what Microsoft told the world, which is how they got into a little bit of trouble in terms of the coverage of this closure, they were still the ones that were likely to be the furthest away from having another kind of profitable project come to full fruition, right? So I think they do make sense from that perspective, but it is, of course, hard to see a company that makes unique things that, as you say, is part of Microsoft's only Japanese footprint get closed in that fashion. So I think there was a reason for kind of the outcry when it occurred. And it is nice to see some semblance of the entity and its intellectual property survive. But I don't know how Krafton's going to use the people at Tango, whether they're going to move them and integrate them into Krafton and make other things, whether they're going to keep Tango as an imprint to make new Hi-Fi Rush games or something else. But I think it is a victory worth celebrating in terms of more game developers not having to lose their jobs and game developers that had had success realizing new and innovative gameplay. So I'm happy about that. I just usually wish that these stories make a little bit more sense at the time, right? Tango was kind of a surprise closure when it was announced. And then to have a buyer come out of the woodwork months on is unusual and does suggest that somebody somewhere made a mistake. Whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Krafton, don't know.
In the press release that announces the deal, it says in part, quote, as part of the strategic agreement, Krafton intends to collaborate with Xbox and ZeniMax to ensure a smooth transition and maintain continuity at Tango Gameworks, allowing the talented team to continue developing the Hi-Fi Rush IP and explore future projects. So my assumption is that I think we know already that they did pitch Hi-Fi Rush 2 or whatever. I would imagine they also probably have some sort of small vertical demo of what could be. I'm thinking about this from an economic perspective, though, Hoeg, and I actually think it's a pretty crafty, pardon the pun, acquisition in the sense that And this is what I was confused about with the closure. Though, again, if you're going to nip and tuck and you kind of, it's like, you're not going to get rid of Arcane. It's like someone's got to go. So I get that. But the reality is the Japanese yen is extremely weak. The Japanese economy it's been stagnant for 30 years. And it's a really cheap place to make high quality games. And people are surprised when Bandai Namco or something has a big year and they're like, we're giving everyone 20% raises. And it's like, dude, they're doing their business overseas. They're making enormous amounts of money and then turning it into yen and making even more money. And so that was one of the things that I was confused about with Microsoft. It's like, don't you want to have a little footprint in this? The cost to quality ratio of game development in Japan is probably the most equitable for publishers anywhere in the world. A game like Resident Evil, let's say 7, would be a $200+ million game at a PlayStation studio in California, but probably wasn't nearly that expensive being made in Japan. Expensive, $100+ million, but so I was wondering, like, why wouldn't you want to be there? And I wonder if Krafton kind of realizes, because this is their first Japanese footprint, it's like, it's not a bad place to be. And I think they might have a little bit more experience because the kind of the deal with the won in South Korea is not as bad, but somewhat similar. Everything's kind of waning. So business is actually pretty lubricated right now. The one thing that I was surprised about with Tango was I didn't know that they had much intrinsic value. And that's why I think it's interesting that you say, like, maybe they just brought them in to kind of wholesale, just get some good talent. But like Mikami's long gone. The kind of gravitational, auteur or creator, the Neil Druckmann or the Kojima or something that studio had access to, which he was of that level, is gone. So it is a little bit of column A and column B for me, where I'm like, I'm not so surprised that they got picked up because of their pedigree and that they're in Japan. But I am a little surprised because they're kind of a hollow shell of themselves in some sense. But that is the shell that produced Hi-Fi Rush. So
yes. No, and I think that's part of the story, right? It's hard to make games. And if you got a company that made a 3D game that was pretty successful, at least in how it was received by the folks that comment on these things, then there's some value in that at any level. And yeah, I think Microsoft maybe was a poor fit for Tango anyway, because Microsoft tends to like a kind of specific action-oriented, large-scale, what we might consider AAA game experience. And their virtue of purchasing publishers has allowed them to get a lot of developers very quickly. But it does mean that they get these package deals that maybe don't fully fit into their strategic vision. And that might have been the case with Tango. I think Arcane Austin getting closed was really a function of Redfall. But I think Tango maybe just was never quite a perfect fit. They wanted the ZeniMax family, and they weren't quite sure what Tango had to offer them.
Yeah, and Tango, it was funny, man. I was friends with one of the brand marketers over there that I worked with at IGN for a long time at Bethesda during the whole deal, and they would often say and imply that Tango was kind of the differentiator. It was like the truly different team under them, making something a little bit different. I think maybe you want these guys to do what they want to do, and I think that that's really important. But getting away from survival horror might have been a bad mistake, just because it's so that genre is becoming so big at the AAA level that, and obviously at the indie level, there's a shit ton of them, that it might have been more fruitful for them to explore that. Maybe they would have kept Mikami in that instance too, although I doubt it. He seemed to be thrilled to be gone. In fact, it seemed like he was gone the millisecond that his buyout was, and he was vested. It seemed like he was gone like that. If you do the math and reverse to where they were purchased, it's like, yeah, that seems to probably be what happened. I don't blame him. And I think he already has popped up somewhere else or is doing some other project now. Okay, so I am interested in the idea of studios kind of, and this is kind of a postscript, but studios kind of going between publishers. Obviously, I think Rare is the biggest example of this. Bungie's obviously also a big example of this, but it doesn't happen very commonly. And this happened, this deal with Tango happened at a time when I was just talking a week or two before on Sacred about why I don't think publishers really want to do deals like this. So I don't, from my personal perspective, expect that many teams are going to be saved in this manner, because I just don't think there's much value in owning the cow. And I think you saw this actually with the unspinning of Toys from Bob from Activision under Xbox, but then Xbox immediately goes in and signs a second party contract with them. It's like they're really just nipping and tucking at some point, cutting millions and tens of millions of dollars off their books wherever they can. It just shows a little bit of a lack of strategy for Xbox, I think. But yeah, I just don't expect.
I think that is certainly a way to read some of the stuff happening at Microsoft. I am not super convinced that they have a fully kind of fleshed out strategic vision for what it is that they are doing. I think that Activision's price coming down from the California lawsuit kind of made it so that they said, we got to spend our money on that. But I don't know that they aren't still kind of figuring out what it is that they actually want to do with all these parts now at this point, which is a nice problem to have if you have billions of dollars to spend on these things. But I think it is clear that Microsoft is still figuring out what direction they want to go with stuff.
Yeah, it's my feeling. You and I discussed this ad nauseum really on when we were talking about the deal with Activision. Was I think that they had a strategy, and I think that strategy elapsed or lapsed over time because things didn't happen quickly enough. And I also just don't think things are going the way that they thought they would go in a lot of different ways too. But they made a bet, and they're doing their best to kind of figure it out. And they're at parity now with PlayStation as far as gross revenue is concerned. And I think that that's what they had kind of wanted, but they needed to go out and grab those things.
Well, and they're big business, right? I mean, like you talk about Toys for Bob at Activision, and it's cultural questions as well as anything else, right? And I think people do forget, because we tend to think of these things as fantasy football players or what have you, moving them around between Sony and Microsoft or anywhere else, that some of these people did start their own companies in order to not work for whoever the publisher was at the time, right? You have all of these stories in the video game industry and every other industry, right? We were just talking about Hoeg Law. One of the reasons I left Big Law is that I just wanted to go and do my own thing, right? And so you have people that make video games that do this, and then they maybe get bought by Microsoft. Maybe you're okay if Bethesda and ZeniMax is the boss because they are a different kind of culture, and then you get worked into Microsoft and you're not as happy. And so you go and you spin off. You still want to sell games to Microsoft. You sign a contract immediately, but you don't want your checks to be signed or your emails to go to Phil Spencer, Satya Nadella, or anywhere else. You don't want to be a part of that kind of bureaucratic entity. And I think that happens more than we give it credit for, that the people and the culture of these entities, even if there might be the maximum amount of potential dollars in the future working with big publisher X, don't want to realize that kind of maximum, that there are like real quality of life. And I don't mean this suggests that working for Sony or working for Microsoft isn't quality, but we all value different things in our lives in general, and certainly in our business and work lives, and that they might not want to work in that environment in any given instance.
Yeah, I would never. I mean, I don't want to say never. I guess people have floated, money and everything for pieces of Last Stand and this and that and these kind of partnerships. And it's like, yeah, sometimes it's tempting, but it's like, I've been in the corporate world. I don't want to ever be there again. So I do appreciate that there are some people like that. I think I'm not sure that being in one or the other is even any safer, No,
I don't think safety is the right thing to drive you.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Because I look at a studio like Firewalk and Concord, which is imminent. Now, it's not my kind of game one way or the other, but this thing seems DOA to me. And how do you feel if you work at that team? Like, how do you feel? Like, there's a decent chance you're going to get... I think the internet
response to Concord has been certainly eye-opening for that team. I personally am excited about that project. I really enjoyed that beta. I think we've talked about that really briefly in other contexts. I don't blame anybody who's not excited about it or didn't like the beta, but I do think that there is an interesting game there. And I think it's got to be devastating from a personal standpoint to have this thing you've worked on, that you do have Sony's apparent full backing. Like, you're getting a lot of stuff from Sony. You're getting a controller, you're getting cartoons, you're getting all this stuff.
They bought your team.
They bought your team. They were so excited about your project. So you have all of these indications that you're on the right track. And then the talking heads, whether it's Hoeg or Colin or anyone else, don't like your project. And now you're putting out your marketing plan. And I don't know how it's going to work. I don't know whether it's going to be a massive success. I suspect, like you, that it's got some birthing pains at minimum, based on what I'm seeing on the internet. I hope it is successful because I think it's a good game. But yeah, it's got to be hard.
Yeah, and I say that only because it's like, okay, so you have all of the money in the world basically at your backing, but you're not necessarily very safe. And then there's like the other end of the spectrum where you're an individual, you put all of your time and effort into a Stardew Valley and you become unreasonably rich, right? Like, there's ups and downs and upside and downside to everything. I think things have been muddled together in a way that they haven't been in games for a long time, where you get your investment, how you find consumers, and I just feel like we're recording this on the first day that Black Myth Wukong game came out, which we're going to talk about in a little while in a different context. But I was like, I had no idea. I knew people were excited about this game. I didn't know that this game was going to sell 10 plus million units probably, which it's going to in its first month or two, because it's already at 2 point something million concurrents on Steam. You imagine it's somewhat similar on PS5. It's like, damn, dude. So like, it's not that I have like this inside view into like what everyone wants. I just look at something like Concord and I think I don't know of many projects that were treated like this in the pre-release environment that did anything at all. Like I can't think of really almost any examples. So that's totally the thing that's, you know, it bodes poorly, but dude, I don't play these games. So from a gameplay perspective, I'm totally agnostic. I'm sure it's actually probably very, considering who's making it, like the people where they come from and the games they've worked on, I'm sure it's very good. But
I'm surprised at how good the
aesthetic and the
feels.
Characters that are there.
I get that. And I get people complaining about that. I hope it succeeds. But you brought up Stardew Valley, and I think there is a kind of confirmation bias we talk about with these things too. Like if you say, oh, I can go and make my own game and make Balatro or Stardew Valley or anything like it, for every one of those, there's probably 100 that fail and wind up losing the house or what have you. And I like to support those people doing that because I like the dreamers. I think we are all advantaged by the people that go out there and bet the house on these things. But making the next Stardew Valley is extraordinarily unlikely. And yes, you're at risk if you're at Bungie and you get sliced off the payroll by Sony, and you're at risk if you go and you try to make Stardew Valley. So it shouldn't be a safety play, but I do think there is a cultural component, and you may just not like reporting to Microsoft or going to whatever number of board and committee meetings you have to go to be a part of that family, or Sony or anyone else. I'm not trying to call out Microsoft specifically here. It's just that we were talking about Tango.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm thinking this is totally unrelated to what we're talking about, but my mind's going here now where what's more likely, you find your way onto a team that's making a culturally relevant AAA game or A game, right? Or you make your own game or work for a smaller studio with more modest expectations. And I would think that they're probably the same or like similar odds, because they're probably, I was thinking in my head as you were talking, like there might only be 20 or let's say between 20 and 30,000 people in the world making relevant video games. Like the games you think about, Fortnite, God of War, Halo. And like, so you find your way into that space. And then, so like, how many people do you think exist in like the somewhat successful indie space? Might be somewhat equivalent spread over many games with much lower overhead and expectations. So yeah, it's exactly what you said about like, there is no appeasing the risk, no matter which direction you go into. But that's
video games are risky. They just are. And I do have the insight of having watched my brother's career, right? So for folks that don't know, my brother is a video game developer. He's worked at places like Insomniac and High Moon Studios when it was a subsidiary of Activision, which I think it still is, under Microsoft.
Where is he now, or do you not say to?
Oh no, I can't. I have to give the full disclaimer as part of this whole conversation, which is to say he is at ZeniMax Online, working on whatever their next big project is.
Cool.
Which my brother is such a good, loyal guy for the company, will not tell his video game loving older brother because it's all under NDA. So they're working on something cool over at ZeniMax Online, but I don't get to hear about it. But yeah, he's gotten to see all of these various aspects of it. And there certainly was a moment in time where you're working on the shooting volume of your 15th gun in the next Call of Duty update for High Moon. And you have to decide whether you want to be a cog in this enormous machine making Call of Duty, or try to do something that might be more personally fulfilling.
Have you ever seen, I wish I had it to share with you now in case you haven't seen it, but there's like it's like a 10-year-old blog post written by someone in the games industry, I think a producer somewhere. And it was like an anecdote about putting a door in a game. Do you know what I'm talking about? This, like,
I think I do.
Where it's like, we want to put a door into this game. And then it's a list of what everyone on the chain has to, like, all of the different employees have to do in order to put the door in the game. Like the designer says, like, does the door swing open, in or out? And how many should there be? And then the programmer puts it there and the artist makes it and the animator animates it and the sound guy puts the sound in, and the proximity of the sound with the engineering and all of the rest. And I'm like, it is a very complicated thing to make big games. And I can imagine it is. If you work at a studio like Insomniac, you're on one hand making a really creative game, and on the other hand, it is a machine.
Yeah, and he was there for a rift in time. Like that's his time frame at Insomniac. Cool. And then he moved over to do some other jobs. He was also in the mobile space for a little bit at company names that I frankly can't remember, Tom. So sorry about that.
Yeah, I'm sure the money in the mobile space at that time was awesome. Like it courted all sorts of, I knew a lot of people that jumped over. I knew people that went to even BioWare's short-lived mobile studio in San Francisco that I don't think ever even released any games. But that was the time when the wheels of commerce were lubricated with mobile money.
He said the founders were getting yacht money. So yeah, not him so much, but the founders.
Exactly. That must be nice. All right. So that's the Tango Gameworks situation. I'm glad we were able to touch on that. I'm always interested in the comings and goings of personnel. So we'll keep a close eye on them. Or as Senator Palpatine says, we'll watch you with great interest.
Yeah, no, I'm happy for everybody that got to keep a job in the games industry that wanted one.
All right. The second thing I wanted to talk about is what's going on at Second Wind. So first of all, have you kept up with any of this before? This is a somewhat elaborate piece of drama, but let me get your take on it first, and then I'll explain why. Because I don't really care about the drama part. I care about the serious accusations that in the seams are leveled specifically at Nick Calandra, who's a friend of the show. And we'll get into all of that. But have you been keeping up with it on your end?
I have been seeing it when it pops up on my Twitter timeline. I have to disclaim to people that I have been a social media internet friend of Nick's for a long, long time. And I have written for him when he was at Escapist. I've written for a couple people around the gaming industry. I don't write articles as a matter of course, but there have been times where it has made sense. So I wrote for Escapist under Nick 1 or 2 times. And so I have certain thoughts about how he operates and his social media demeanor. But I only really followed up on the full extent of let's call them the Frost allegations this morning when you told me that we were going to be talking about it, because I wanted to make sure I had a full understanding of what was even leveled at him as part of this video.
So yeah, let me catch everyone up for a few moments here about what's going on and why this is interesting and I guess relevant, and why I get people's hesitance in the mainstream space to touch stories like this because you don't really know and all of the rest. But I put on my journalism cap. I used to be a journalist, as everyone knows, and journalism is so scarce in our industry. And I'm not even saying that to be a dickhead. It just is. There are very few people that do any level of journalism, just open journalism, that I often venture back into those trenches, those mustard gas filled trenches. And I messaged Nick and I was just like, I have a series of questions. I actually put it in our Discord to show everyone, on our staff Discord, of course, to show everyone, like, these are the things I asked him, because like, why isn't anyone just trying to get to the source and like try to figure out like what is true and what isn't? And Nick, graciously gave me like 3 pages worth of notes that we'll read from here as we go forward. But to kind of catch everyone up on what's going on, Second Wind is a Patreon supported, very popular Patreon supported media entity, not unlike Last Stand Media. And the main thrust of it is that these are the guys that used to run kind of the most recent example of The Escapist, Nick Calandra being the editor-in-chief of the Escapist, and then kind of all the talent that was under him, or much of the talent. Some of the talent I know. Marty Sleva is one of those guys. I used to work with him at IGN back in the day. I emailed him a couple times a few years ago, and he never emailed or DM'd or whatever, and he never got back to me. So I've stopped kind of trying to reach out because I feel like I'm bothering people. But I liked Marty. I like Marty. I think he's an interesting guy. So I know him. I know Nick from corresponding. He's been on the show maybe a couple of times. I'm not sure how many times he's been on. I want to say 2, but maybe I don't know how many. And so I know him, and Yahtzee, of course, is the big name over there. Now, I'm not, and I don't say this to be a dickhead. I think everyone just knows this about me, is I'm not a consumer at all of games media. Like, I read Video Games Chronicle, Push Square, Games Industry, like those sites, but I don't listen to podcasts, watch videos, unless it's like retro stuff or anything like that. Every once in a while, I'll watch a long play on World of Long Plays. Shout out. Love that site, or love that YouTube channel. Awesome. Just an awesome repository of gaming knowledge, firsthand primary gaming knowledge. But otherwise, I'm not really familiar with their content, and they are a competitor. So I guess you could look at getting involved in this as kind of trying to play in that field. And that was a little bit why I didn't want to say anything about it for a while, because I don't want to make it come off like that.
Yeah.
But I also, and did you watch? So this is all encapsulated around a guy named Frost. I don't know this person. This person apparently is 25-ish and has worked with Nick going back to The Escapist and apparently has some deep problems with him. He quit and put up this huge post and really kind of went in and shouldered Nick Calandra as a leader, a manager, a steward of money, whatever the case might be. And then he released this short video that really, I don't even really understand the point of it. And I think he deleted it at some point. I didn't really know what it was trying to say to anyone. And then he released this much longer 25-ish minute video.
Yeah, the one I watched, I think, was 28 minutes.
Yeah, 28. That's probably the same one. And I watched it too. And then I went through and watched it again. And when I did, I pulled out all of the things that I thought I wanted to ask Nick about, because basically what this video does, and people should just go watch it if you're interested, but it makes accusations that it makes a lot of accusations against this guy, Nick Calandra, who's
in like rapid fire succession. Yes.
Right. So I started pausing it, going into the transcript, pulling out a bunch of verbatim quotes, and then I sent them to Nick. And one of the things that I said to Nick, and this is what I want to say at the top, is that not knowing this Frost person, I would say that this is a really unfocused delivery of information. And this is why I said earlier, Hoeg, in the seams of the video are the serious accusations. He spends all of this time talking about the stupidest shit. And this is what I told Nick. I'm like, dude, I don't give a fuck. And I think I use that exact terminology about any of like the managerial stuff, the internal drama, and some of the things that he was leveraging at you like they were wrong, I thought were fucking stupid. And I want to go into those first. So this video goes into his managerial style. I don't know, man. People, I think we have a pretty harmonious back and forth with my own staff. They can speak for themselves on that. But there's things that happen behind the scenes sometimes. Like, it's not easy running a company. People get grinded up. I don't want to get involved in people's drama that way. That's kind of your business. IGN was a really messy place behind the scenes, but the product was good. And that's just the way it goes sometimes. Go into a fucking sports locker room or sometime or whatever. Or, you know, it's like sometimes like under great pressure come diamonds. So I'm not so worried about that. I don't care about that. A lot of stuff about his previous work, because he ran that website that was prominent for a minute, onlysp.com and the Escapist and all. And I think Prima Games kind of revival and all the rest.
Strategy video channel. Yeah.
Right. And I think some of this stuff failed. I don't care about that either. I think that a lot of that is not worth anything. A lot of the stuff is going to fail. I don't think I could run Prima, for instance, and make it worthwhile anymore. There was this whole thing that he went into in the video about how Nick takes game codes from publishers and puts them on his own account. I'm like, everyone does that for time immemorial. People have been like, this is one of the things where I'm like, do you know anything about what you're talking about as far as like perspective in the games industry, like deep perspective? That's not the way it ever worked. Going all the way back to 2005, when codes started becoming prominent with the release of Xbox 360's Xbox Live, you would just take the codes and put them on your thing. You would get games sent to you and put them in your library. It's like complaining about a film critic seeing movies. It's like complaining about a TV critic getting screeners in the mail.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like sharing the screeners with your family is the closest to that, which is like technically a party foul. Like in an ideal world, there'd be an IGN or whatever platform library of codes, and it would belong to the entity because that's an asset of the entities at some level. But it doesn't surprise me at all that the common kind of approach is to put it on the account that you already have, because you're going to be functioning with it in your own computer capacity. So that's fair.
Yeah. I also just think it's a technically, maybe not for very small teams, but when I was at IGN, I would get a code for everything, like everything that ever came out. We have 40 of us in editorial. We're going to share one PSN account. We're going to share one Xbox Live account and one Steam account. This is just this. I've never even heard this complaint before, because that, again, is just the perk of doing the job is like, yeah, okay, I have this game. I have to review it. I'm just going to claim it so I can review the game. It's really not much more than that. No one's claiming these codes to just stock them up to play them later. Who the fuck has the time to do that? I just felt like that was a very unfocused thing to leverage. So too was the whole Twitter money thing and monetizing Twitter. It's like, what are you talking? Like, I don't understand any of that. The drama behind the co-op, and I think he makes a specific claim at one point that Nick has sold his other businesses, which is a big thing that he talks about. and that he's trying to, like, maybe he'll just sell Second Wind. Like, as far as I understand, Nick can't just sell Second Wind. I don't understand like what you're even talking about. And they also make a complaint, and this one really resonated with me because I get it, but it's not really a good argument, is he sold his Gamementary website or whatever that was basically done with free labor, and then he pocketed, the money. And I'm like, yeah, but see, this like really like Spidey sense to me, or not Spidey sense. I guess that would be a bad, because that would be like the future, right? That's not really like what I'm looking for, the right reference. But this scratched something deep in me where I'm like, this is what happened with GameFAQs back in the day. Like GameFAQs was sold, I want to say, for $10 million to what was at the time like the Imagine Games Network. And there were a lot of people there upset, being like, this is our work, like that you're selling. And it's like, you chose to put it here, dude. Too bad. This is a repository. Like, we didn't offer you anything. You're choosing to use this and like, so it's the same thing there where I'm like, dude, you got to just know what time it is. I mean, were you used? Maybe. Was I used by CJC at GameFAQs back in the day when he made all of his millions of dollars on the site? I guess, but I was kind of using him too. I wanted attention. I wanted a place to publish. So that didn't wash with me either. And then there were two other things that I thought were weird. There was a comment made by someone in the video, and this was a little weird, where it's like someone said something like, we'll be fine without Yahtzee. It's like, no, you won't.
Yeah, I think Jack Packard, I believe, admitted to being the person that said that on Twitter. So we do have that understanding, but I want to add to that notion that that's used in the video for evidence that essentially the co-members of Second Wind don't know what they're doing. And that might be true, but in general, that doesn't make you evil. And reasonable minds can disagree on whether or not something like an entity could survive with your best producer, right? We have lots of movies and television shows about that notion of what can you do without Jerry Maguire, or with Jerry Maguire if you're Renee Zellweger. I mean, however you're going about this, that's part of the conversation. And I do think we can skip it because it's unimportant, but I don't think we can skip it in the context of this video being created, that so much of it is focused on what sounds to me of essentially disagreements with managerial style and business decision-making between the maker of the video, Frost, and Nick. And that's fine. There's all these sorts of instances where people disagree with what their boss is doing and think that they're doing a bad job of being a boss. But that's what it comes out to me, listening to 90% of this part of the video. And I am going to put on my corporate lawyer hat and discount that mostly as sour grapes, even if Nick proves to be someone that fails with Second Wind. And I don't know. Nobody does. Frost doesn't know what's going to happen to Second Wind in its foreseeable future. But a lot of this video is, he spends too much money trying to grow these various things, and he clutters the timeline, and he makes these bad choices. And it's like, yeah, that's a strategic decision. And sometimes you do have to spend money to make money and all these various things. What I got from the video was that there was a very strong disagreement between these particular individuals about what the future of this group should look like. And I don't know the organizational structure of Second Wind, but it does sound like they don't have a great mechanism for handling those particular disagreements within their corporate structure.
Yeah, well, this is why when I had Nick on one of the times and we were talking about the company, because I love the idea of spinning out and doing new things. And it's what I did twice. So it's like I have a soft spot for that. And I've said it before, and it's not a joke. Like, I want these other Patreons to do well because I just think it's actually good for Patreon. And then it gets more people on the platform, and then they find us. And this happens constantly. I can see all the statistics. Like, many people support all of us, or many of us. So it's good for all of us to do well there. So I am rooting for the competitors because I don't really think it carves anything out from us, or it carves very little, or it's negligible or whatever. But I told him at the time, I'm like, co-op, man, I think you're making a huge, I said, if you'll go watch the video, because people bring it up sometimes, I'm like, I think that's a big mistake, because, and I've said this before, but we identified this as kind of funny because we had an even amount of us, 4 of us, founding the company. And we knew immediately, it's like, we can't do this way, because we're going to have some sort of wedge between us if it's 2-on-2 all the time, which it could have very well reasonably been. And I think we kind of predicted it might be that way because of me and Greg's close relationship. We'd always kind of be a pair. It didn't end up really working out like that, but to stymie that possibility, we gave Greg 40% of the company. And so it was, and we thought that that was fair. Greg was like the big name, taking the biggest risk, doing all the rest. And we each got 20% from that. And I was totally happy with that. That ended up being a massively lucrative piece of the company for me when I left. So I would have been even awesome to have twice that much, but it was great. So I'm not complaining by any stretch of the imagination, but it was necessary because then what that meant was it could be Greg plus one to make any decision, or the three of us together against Greg to stop anything from happening if Greg wanted something to happen. And that I don't think even ever came to be. So I was surprised that they didn't see that, like, by splitting it like a co-op. I only really, and I've said this before, only know of really one successful co-op in all of gaming of any scale, and that's Motion Twin. Even the big ones that were kind of working like them ended up melting down, like ZAUM and others. So it's just, in my opinion, and you probably know this, and I would imagine feel this way in business as well, in your experience with it, you have to have like shot callers and people that are responsible for things. And the reality is that in Last Stand, everything is not my decision, but I make decisions to put people in positions where they make the decisions. And if they make a fucked up decision, is it their fault? Yes. But ultimately, as Truman said, the buck stops with me, and it is me. It's like, it's ultimately my fault. I made the call. When you have 9 people or whatever, all with the same percentage, and you have this just nebulous net of people, but it's not really a hierarchy because you all own the same percentage of the company. I just imagine that is very, very complex. That's a big part, Hoeg, why I didn't really ever want to talk about this problem, because I'm like, I know that that's going to be a problem. So I don't give a fuck. I mean, it's up to them. I just know that I own all of Last Stand, and the decisions ultimately rest with me, even if I didn't make them. And so
and it's tricky, right? Like, I don't know whether they used a lawyer or not, but I feel like it is incumbent upon me when I'm forming an entity for a client to have that conversation, right? Because that's an uncomfortable conversation, because you have to imagine you are now in a pitched fight with these friends that you are starting something together with right now. But that's the job of the lawyer to say, yes, okay, they're your friends. That's fantastic. What if you disagree and it's really mean? You really disagree on a fundamental problem. What happens with the functioning of the entity? Because the worst possible thing that can happen is a deadlock. Because the only way the law really has to handle a deadlock is to have a court liquidate the entity and do various other things which are terrible. You don't want to liquidate on a forced sale because you're not going to get remotely the value that you get out of your entity. So you got to have some notion of different percentages, or somebody gets a double vote if it's going to be a deadlock, or those kinds of things. And I don't know whether they had a lawyer or not. I don't know fully, even if they call themselves a cooperative, what their legal entity looks like. Some states recognize cooperatives. Some would have you go through a kind of general or limited partnership to get that done. I tend to form entities as LLCs because they get a certain amount of tax flexibility between partnership and corporations. But I didn't represent Second Wind, certainly. And I have in the past represented companies like yours. I'm certainly not your lawyer, Colin. But for folks that don't know, I have permission to say that I did counsel Easy Allies in their creation, for instance. I can't go into the specifics there because that is all privileged. But they were worried about these problems that you just identified as well. And I certainly think it's tricky. And I certainly think part of what you just said, Colin, which is the buck stops with you and you put people in these various positions, you can imagine a circumstance where even if, however you've structured your entity, that if you're not that kind of personality, that could rub people the wrong way, that you are a bad boss in some respects. And I think that Nick could be a bad boss. I haven't had that experience with him. I don't know whether Frost's grievances are legitimate, but it's possible. I can imagine a scenario where he doesn't have that kind of personality and he is putting things off on people, and that could rub folks the wrong way. And I think the result would be a video like the one we saw without ethical or legal breaches, right? I think what we saw really is a kind of angry, frustrated ex-employee. And honestly, I didn't see a lot there that would really concern me. Now, there is one area that is concerning to the lawyer, which is that he's accused essentially of taking money for coverage and then not disclaiming it as part of the process, and having essentially editorial make things on a basis where he didn't disclose it even to his own people. And that's both an ethical and potentially a legal breach, depending on exactly how those were advertised and put out there to the public. And I get concerned about those kinds of things. But they are, as you say, almost in the margins of the video. They're almost just in text while he talks about something else. And so I don't know exactly how serious that is, or from my perspective, whether or not I should discount that as being part of this attack, criticism of what is essentially the managerial style and business decisions of this individual.
Right. It just seems a lot of it seems very personal, and like you don't really want to be saying this stuff publicly, not only because it makes someone like Nick look bad, maybe undeservedly, potentially, but also because you look like an asshole. And
it looks like I would never hire Frost.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. And you know what? I was thinking, Hoeg, I say this all the time. I'm turning 40 in October, and I only feel like it's since I've been in my mid 30s. And maybe this is a little dramatic, but I'm like, where I really feel like I have a good grasp on like things. And when I was 25, I was a few years deep into my full-time IGN career, but I still didn't have a full grasp on corporate etiquette and what you say and don't say. I said a lot of things, not a lot, but I said things to people I shouldn't have said, started arguments that I shouldn't have started, had beef with people that I shouldn't have had beef with internally.
I did too. You can't get out of youth, folks.
Right.
And that's going to happen.
And I'm embarrassed by some of it. I don't know if I ever talked about this, but one that sticks out to me specifically is I said something about, like, on an email chain about, you know, like something about Jessica Chobot, but just about like, why is she getting, like, why are we talking about this? Or like, why are we pretending that this matters or something like that? Something kind of just mean. Right. And she was on the chain and I didn't know, you know, and I just remember this was, I don't know, in 2010 or something. And I was like, damn, I didn't mean to be, you know, flippant about your position here or whatever it was, you know. It was like, and I wish I still had access to my email so I would remember it better. But it's just like, you look at things like that and you're like, and I realize that more as I get older, where I'm like, you just don't have to send this email. You don't have to say this like this. You should read this again and all of that. And this is the way that Frost guy comes off, where I'm like, I feel like you're going to have regretted doing this. And it's hard to put this genie back in the bottle at this point. And while you say so the stuff in the seams and the margins, as you put it, is what I wanted to ask him about to Nick. So I sent Nick a really long email. Okay. And I asked him a bunch of stuff. There were 4 quotes that I was worried about that he said, just 4. So this is, again, you said a 28-minute video. I've pulled 4 quotes out of it. That might be a total of a minute long. And I asked him to comment on these things. So here are the things that in quotes that, you know, so verbatim that Frost said about him. And then I'll tell you what he said, Nick said, and I can share with you guys back here. So the first thing I said, and this is again quoting Frost, quote, "He blackballed developers that asked for coverage one too many times for his liking, even though he set himself as the direct point of contact for the group, and was actively against the idea of us giving free shoutouts or small deals for smaller devs who couldn't afford it. He would then try to funnel them back his way to bargain for paid consultations," end quote. So you know what? I'll read all of the things I asked him first because they're all kind of muddled. They're all kind of the same thing. And then we'll get into what he told me. Number 2, the quote was, quote, "Trading positive press, positive reviews, and documentary opportunities without disclosing that publishers were paying for his trips, paying for the documentaries, and Nick was bargaining for future employment. This isn't stuff that only happened 6 years ago. This was stuff happening while we were at SWG and Escapist and every other outlet that he worked for the past 6 years," end quote. And a similar quote was, quote, "Nick trades good press coverage and holds back criticism in exchange for paid documentaries, trips, gear, and job opportunities. And a lot of his connections stem from his gamementary days. His staff at the time was not pleased when they found out. This recontextualized one of Nick's patterns of behavior. A lot of Nick's personal tastes and biases that he pushed on his staff for coverage or restricted them from criticizing led back to his PR connections. He was making deals behind the scenes without them knowing. I even found one where he threw in a positive review to sweeten the deal, offer flights, gifts, jobs, favors, documentary opportunities, none disclosed," end quote. And the final quote, again in the similar spirit, quote, "Nick went on to the Escapist magazine and somehow ended up as editor-in-chief. Talking to workers that were there before my time, Nick isolated a few of the content creators and lorded over them with his heavy-handed content direction. Say you wanted to cover your favorite game, well, Nick wouldn't greenlight or promote it unless you covered one of his favorite games first or one of his undisclosed connections. I can't state the games because it might reveal the creators, but he was getting bolder with the unethical quid pro quo. More documentary opportunities as well as gaming gear were coming up for Calandra," end quote. So those are the 4 things I asked him about. I'm like, these are really the only 4 things that this guy says that I think are even interesting to get into, because this is leveraging a level of deep corruption on your part. And he says it. He uses the term quid pro quo. And I whenever I use the term quid pro quo, I have to cite Austin Powers and say squid pro row, because that's what he says in the film. So getting this all out there, I guess, Hoeg, to kind of start, it is clear what he's saying, right? That his accusation is that Nick has deep PR connections and is funneling kind of through these PR connections opportunities that will enrich him in some way or give him a benefit of a free trip or this or that. And even the trip thing, I said to Nick at the time, I'm like, dude, IGN used to fly on any publisher or developer's dime to go see a game. So that even is like whatever. But although a lot of outlets didn't do that. So there is that too.
Well, trips are interesting, right? Like I actually got into a Twitter discussion, I think with Ryan McCaffrey, about a trip to the Galactic Star Cruiser for Disney, where because it's not a video game, I felt that IGN should have disclosed that their trip was paid for because it's such an enormous expense when they reviewed the Star Cruiser. And Ryan disagreed. And we had this whole conversation. And reasonable minds can differ. It was a good conversation. That's kind of one of the reasons I like Twitter and social media in general, is to have those talks. But yeah, he made apparent that IGN accepts trips, certainly within the video game sphere, where you would expect that most big outlets are going to have those trips. I just thought it was an issue in particular with a hotel, because I don't expect IGN to get free hotels. But yeah, I think that's a part of the conversation. And I agree with you that I wouldn't necessarily expect someone making a documentary of games, for instance, to not have been paid to go and bring their camera gear to make that documentary. So that one doesn't shock the conscience, as the lawyers might say.
Right. It's funny because I can see it both ways, where we would get, when I was in press, we would get invited to like PlayStation Experience. That's a great example, right? Or not even PlayStation Experience. A great example is when the PS4 was revealed in 2013 in New York City. We get our invitations. They invite us. They pay for our flights. They put us up in a really nice hotel. They pay for transportation to the event. We would do this no problem. And I didn't really even know that there was anything really wrong with it. And frankly, I didn't want to do a lot of this shit anyway. So I've always felt like I was being put out. It's like, I wasn't even smart enough to know that they were trying to like lubricate me a little bit. I was like, I want to just be back in my fucking bed. I don't want to even be here doing this at all. But there were outlets at the time, I can't remember what specific ones, that like would get the details, but do their own travel, their own hotel, just to kind of separate that. And I get that. And in hindsight, it's like, well, I wasn't the decision maker, but in hindsight, it's like, yeah, I understand that, but I didn't really care one way or the other. And again, that's not really what I'm interested in what he's saying, because the bigger thing is that Frost is saying that Nick has some sort of unsavory connection with PR, where he's manipulating coverage, and this is something that I did underline for Nick. It's like the accusation that you're basically getting consultation, or like getting consultancy stuff from them. I mean, that would be deeply unethical for me. So I, again, emailed Nick all of this stuff, and he made a document, a Google document, and got the permission from the guys to share it with me over at Second Wind. And so he kind of split things up. So we'll go through this and I'll read it out to you. And then you can, if you have anything, we can go through these things one by one. So the accusation is he blackballed developers that asked for coverage one too many times for his liking. Nick says this, quote, "This has never once happened." And he says the single developer that Frost referred to in his video, it's just random indie studio. "This developer reached out to me and others on his team quite a few times to pitch his game for coverage. I've only had friendly interactions with this developer, but he would often be in my mentions talking about his game as a way for me to notice it. That eventually veered into spam territory, in my opinion. He then messaged Frost about putting a billboard for Second Wind into his game, which we turned down because it just seemed to me like another way for us to promote his game, as this was around the time Second Wind got started up and was all over the news," end quote. So that in of itself is interesting information that I think puts things in the context. And I get that. Like, that has happened to me many times. People are super fucking annoying on the internet sometimes. They don't read social cues. They don't understand any sort of level of professionalism of getting involved with people. They also don't understand that, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, we have an infinite number of games to cover now. It's just not even a problem to find things to cover. And so it's not 10 or 20 years ago when you really would try to cover everything that was coming to a console and talk about things. Things just fall through the seams, and that sucks. So that's a little bit of context there. So the accusation that Frost makes that he blackballed developers that asked for coverage one too many times, Nick's saying here, quote unquote, this has never once happened. So
yeah, and I think from my perspective, I hear blackball, I think blacklist, that the accusation is that somebody essentially frustrated him, bugged him on a personal level, and then the company wasn't going to cover any of their stuff now or in the future. And that might be reading too much into the term blackball. I don't know. When you use those kind of terms in a video like this, that's kind of the risk you take. But what Nick describes is what I would anticipate someone dealing in the video game commentary industry would regularly deal with and say. When we get into the rest of this, where whether he spins that around to a consultancy and that kind of thing, is where I think the bigger questions lie. But certainly being on the internet and having a minor presence compared to you, Last Stand, and seeing how many people essentially ask for your time and attention, which is great. I love that. I love to hear from folks, but it can sometimes be a little much. Sometimes you have to say no. And that in and of itself is certainly not a crime from my perspective.
Right. I agree. And so that's one thing that I think that Nick has nipped in the bud. I guess it's all he said, she said. It depends on who you believe, I guess. But at least, see, this is what I think that they could have done a better job of being vociferous in defense if these things weren't true, and it seems like a lot of the stuff isn't true. So I'm a little confused by the communications. But
well, I think
go ahead.
I can't speak for Nick personally, obviously, but I do know he was getting dragged into social media drama that I personally wasn't terribly comfortable with a little bit before this all happened. He was kind of intimately involved in some of the Mark Kern Grum's talk about things online. And it was of a nature and a kind of attitude that I was not used to seeing from Nick or on my timeline. And so I think he might just be essentially trying to not work through social media or internet communications for at least a little while. I don't know if that's in fact the case, but I do know that I've seen people have to go through that. I've certainly been involved with unfortunate internet dramas myself. And sometimes they can spin away from you if you don't stop talking.
Right. And that's, again, the wisdom of getting older is like when I decided in 2021 that I'm just not really going to engage with any of this shit anymore. It does bring, I wouldn't say peace to my life because I'm a very anxious and stressed out person regardless, but it's certainly like one less dynamic I have to worry about. And that is a relevant thing, I guess, to bring up in regards to what's going on with Nick is that he did get wrapped up into this thing, this kind of, like you said, with Grums and kind of the new culture war stuff. And I reached out to him multiple times as he acknowledged in his email to me being like, you really should just stop. You're not, I don't think I said this in so many words, maybe the first one or two times. Maybe I was a little more precise with it later. I don't really remember, but I was like, you should just stop. And ultimately you don't look very good in doing this kind of stuff. And I used to get into some internet scrums as well, but I felt like knew when to walk away from things and never got anywhere close to an order of magnitude to what I felt like this was getting. And it got to the point, and I didn't tell Nick this, but it got to the point where I just muted him on Twitter for a while. And then I think I unmuted him when I saw something, it says like, you've muted this account when someone answers something. And I'm like, oh, I forgot I even muted him. And then it seemed like maybe he wasn't doing that kind of stuff anymore. But I was deeply confused by it too, because it felt very destructive, like self-destructive to the brand. And I feel like maybe that's where some of the animosity that Frost has comes from, because he says it only in passing, but it's that like this behavior was torching things for them behind the scenes, which I would believe. And there's some evidence, I don't know where a lot of this stuff comes from, but that he was kind of threatened with removal if he didn't stop. And it seems like that kind of worked. And I think that that's perfectly reasonable, because I think he was completely it's not that he was out of line. It's like, say and do what you want. I don't care. And I don't like this Grums character very much. I think he's a wildly imperfect messenger to fight this culture war, as I've said many, many times. It's not that he's wrong about everything. It's that he's wrong about a lot of things. And you need to be very precise, very similar to the way Frost needed to be more precise in his words and so on and so forth in his video. So, anyway, that's a relevant thing to bring up, that Nick's behavior, I think, courted a lot of animosity towards him. And it seemed like it was for no reason. Like, I'm not sure what drove him.
Yeah, I don't know what the inciting event was either, but it did appear to be a little bit of a social media spin out before all this happened.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just unfortunate because I don't know what people don't understand about, in some sense, about being online. And maybe I didn't understand this at first either, but I've been online, like deeply online in quotes, for 30 years. You know, it's like second nature at this point. But if you put yourself and your name out there and your opinions, people are going to talk shit about you. People are going to misinterpret you. They're going to clip you out. They're going to make fun of you. They're going to degrade you and demean you. And I've said many times, and I think I probably also said this to Nick, that there's nothing anyone can say to him that hasn't been said to me. And there's really nothing that has been said right up to people killing me, telling me where I live, or wanting to tell me they're going to kill me, tell me where I live, that they're going to see me at a comic convention, or all those kinds of things. It's like all the way to that level. That's kind of, I'm not saying it's right or good. I'm not saying you should do that to other people. I'm saying it's kind of comes with the territory. And if you get caught into shit like that, that could become your full-time job. Go read the responses to the things I tweet out. Like totally innocuous, just observations, clips. You can't control other people's behavior. And you're not responsible for it. Normal, good, decent, honest, intellectual people see through all of that stuff and know what's real and what's not. It's not that hard to see the genuine from the disingenuous. So just wanted to throw that out there too. So it seems like he was convinced, maybe by the barrel of a gun in some sense, to stop doing that kind of thing. Because I don't think he did himself any favors. If he wasn't like that and then all of this happened, I think it would be much less skeptical of him. I just don't think he started from a good place. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I
don't know, because I think that there's something there, because I had just remembered that part of this video from Frost has what he calls a section, but it's really like a sentence where he says this is not a right-wing grift, I think.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, it's in the beginning.
So there's like a vague kind of political allusion to some kind of schism at Second Wind. And I would have to really unpack like the direction that Nick was going on all this and how Frost might have wanted him to go. But again, that's essentially a difference of opinion, a difference of strategy. And I tend to agree with you that I wouldn't, if I were a member of that group or if I were the head of that group, want the face of my group to be out there doing this kind of stuff on social media. So I get that as a point of disagreement. I don't quite get raising that to the level of a drama video after the fact, but yeah. I also wasn't in the room and seeing all this happen in real time.
Right. And yeah, that's a good point. I think, unfortunately, Nick, who I think is a reasonable actor and a decent person, a good person. I don't know him personally, but he seems like a perfectly nice person. I think he got caught up in the same traps that in Gamergate a lot of people got caught up in, and I was at IGN at the time and really arguing behind the scenes for us to not say anything, because I was like, you can't win in situations like this, so you don't want to give them free ammunition. Starving of oxygen may not work, but it's like kind of your only path forward is to just kind of ignore it and move forward, because then you give them targets and then they're going to win. And that's kind of what happened. Like, they're going to make you look like a fool no matter what is real or what's not. It's the culture war. And you just don't want, so that everyone that fought against Gamergate, in quotes, your Lee Alexanders and your what was Zoe Quinns and all these people were kind of like, I don't want to say ruined over it, but they were kind of, it seemed to me like their lives were kind of like fucked up over this, because it didn't matter if they were right or wrong or how you felt about them. You were just giving them a fresh, nice target to fight with. And then you heighten them because now they have like a vanquished target. And that's what I think Nick did for Grums in some way. And whether or not you agree with Grums or not, I don't care. It's up to you. But I think that's pretty demonstrable. And I think that was a mistake. All right. So Nick goes on and talks about the Frost quote, that he was, quote, actively against the idea of us giving free shout outs or small deals for smaller devs who couldn't afford it, end quote. Nick says this, quote, "We offer very affordable rates to indie devs for our sponsorships, and we've cut plenty of deals with those that had smaller budgets. We have adjusted our pricing structure several times to try to be even more affordable to smaller devs, talking less than 4 figures even. The staff has always been free to talk about whatever they want over all of our streams, podcasts, and videos," end quote. So I guess what he's saying here is twofold. First, that people can kind of say whatever they want about any of these games. It doesn't matter. And I believe that. And the second thing is that they've had lower budget, even 3-figure, which is very low for people that don't know. It's like not even worth doing a 3-figure ad deal. It's not something that really happens. So they've been very accommodating to try to get things out there, which is cool.
Right. And I think from the perspective of the corporate lawyer bootlicker that I'm so often known as on my side of the world, it wouldn't have bothered me if Nick's response to that is, hey, look, we sell a product here. It's our advertising space. And so you can 100% talk about whatever you want, but we can't be giving away shout outs that we would otherwise sell and discount what our product is. And this is one of the reasons why in larger organizations, you usually see a firewall between editorial and advertising or whatever you want to call it, business. And I do think when I get to that section of the Frost video, I tend to think that Frost isn't thinking of Second Wind as a business. And so he seems very much convinced that him and Yahtzee are the only value at Second Wind and that everything that Nick is doing is kind of only to line his own pockets. But at least for this particular complaint, what I hear is, don't give away the milk that we're selling in the store. And yes, that might be better if it's not a message from the chief executive to editorial. But again, I think you can claim that there's an ethical breach there potentially. I don't know that they're structured to actually have a full firewall or to think about these things from that perspective.
Yeah, it's so well said. And it is interesting just to think through kind of the foundational approach that each organization has to even selling ads or getting money from entities, endemic and non-endemic. This has really nothing to do with what's being said because it's kind of par for the course for game outlets. But Last Stand just by rule doesn't take what's called endemic advertising. We will not advertise video games. And we've turned down, and I've said before, 6 figures at this point worth of easily. I mean, somewhat deep 6 figures, I would imagine at this point in Sacred Symbols, especially in just turning down straight up advertising opportunities. And the closest we ever got to taking an advertising opportunity from a game-centric thing was The Last of Us did that podcast for the HBO show. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I guess that's far enough away where like we would be okay with that. I'm not crazy about that.
At least 2 steps removed.
Right. I'm not, there's a thing where you kind of have to, your ad reps are working on your behalf, right? And so you want to play ball and you don't want them to go and get these deals. And then you're like, nah, like we do that once in a while, but you want to, they're like making us money and you want to, it's a back and forth. Like it's supposed to be a relationship, right? And so sometimes you do, it's like, okay, I'm not sure what the fit is here. We have to find the right person, whatever the good might be, but we'll do it. And that was the thing with The Last of Us podcast for the HBO show. So like you said, 2 things removed, but that didn't even really come together anyway. And so like we would never get any closer than that. And certainly not about video games themselves. And I say this only because this removes all of this drama about the way people perceive your relationship with the companies if you just don't have relationships with the companies. And I know that this seems like so easier said than done, but I really feel like people overestimate, especially in this era, the idea of access. Access 20 years ago, all right, first of all, access 40 or 30 years ago was everything. Access during the internet age started to become less relevant because things were quicker to print. And you could just get things out there and so on and so forth, to the point where I think we've gotten now, 2024, all these years later, it's like access. Who gives a shit? You know, like just go buy the game and say what you want about it. You don't need these people to succeed. And I'm a little worried about companies that are wrapped up financially in the products that they cover in an intimate way, not from a necessarily disclosure point of view, but from a safety point of view. Like you are somewhat reliant on the very things that you're covering. And how does that seep into your mind subconsciously even? I've said many, many, many times that I think I'd be lying if I sat here and said that all of the people I ever knew in the games industry and all the connections I had never once subconsciously played into the things I said or did. Of course.
Yeah. I mean, you're a human being.
You know, like.
Well, and on the kind of opposite side of this, I have commented on, I think there's a virtual legality still up, about some of the issues I have with the optics of folks like your former colleague, Greg Miller, like hosting like the Electronic Arts show and things like that.
Right.
Which is to say that once you have that kind of relationship, I have to consider that you're thinking about not just that relationship, but what future contracts could be for other hosting opportunities, and that folks in your position, Colin, and Kind of Funny's position have to think about what it is that they are selling and what it is that people are coming to watch them for when they are considering signing up to contracts like that. And I'm not saying that because I don't understand that it's a livelihood and you got to put food on the table and keep the lights on and all these various things, but that what you're selling in terms of commentary, whether you're at Second Wind Group or Kind of Funny or anywhere else, is to some extent your sincerity. And so, yeah, you have to be concerned about that from an editorial perspective. And I think this stuff that we're talking about from Frost's accusation, this is why they're the most important, not from a legal perspective necessarily, but certainly from an ethical and really the value of your business bottom line.
Yeah, I just don't feel like the exposure is worth it. I think of the endemic ads and the endemic access, though I understand that major companies like IGN and others are totally dependent on that, not only from access, but really more for the ad revenue, millions and millions of dollars worth, tens of millions of dollars worth a year. And back in the day, even more than that. And I just, I'm glad that you can say whatever you want about Last Stand. The content sucks. I suck. No one knows what they're talking about. You all have bad taste. Like, whatever. Say all that shit. It's fine. I don't care. It's totally fine. But you could never say that someone bought us off. You can never say that we got access in return for a quid pro quo. You can never say, because we just don't get any of that shit. Every once in a while, it happened most recently with SteamWorld Heist 2 or whatever, where I got an email from a PR person being like, do you want this code? And I just ignored it. And then they're like, email me back. And I'm like, because it's gotten around very sufficiently at this point. Like, you don't have to bother. Like, we're not interested. And you have to every once in a while seed that still with PR people. And some of the, especially the Japanese AAA publishers, are still quite aggressive in trying to get us to play things and access things earlier. And I'm just like, I'm happy this way. It takes the pressure off of me. No one expects day and date or embargo coverage, which is sweet because I fucking hate playing under embargo. And I was really used to doing that for many years. And then no one can accuse you of anything. Like, it would just be silly. You watch Sacred Symbols and you're in Sony's pocket. And it's like, dude, I haven't had a conversation with Sony in more than 5 years for any reason. No contact. So that's what I'm saying. Like, I really encourage companies to get away from this. Non-endemic ads. I'll run non-endemic advertising all fucking day. Give a shit. And we do.
This is where you splice in the ad for laughs, Colin.
Right. No ads on Sacred Symbols Plus.
There you go.
For our patrons, of course. All right. So he says this then. Frost says, quote, he would then try to funnel them back his way so the developers and publishers to bargain for paid consultations, end quote. This was something I was most concerned about because this is a trap for people to get into, where it's like, who are you serving and can you do it while being an honest arbiter of games, when really what you're bringing into the situation is your own expertise, like your honest expertise, which might come into conflict with the critical and commercial reception of the game later on. It's just too complicated. I don't think people want to get involved in those kinds of things. Now, I have done some consulting in my life and continue to, although I'm not doing anything active right now in the games industry. But my rule is, generally speaking, and I would maybe make an exception with a conversation with the audience if something very tantalizing came up, but it's not going to, and I don't care. It's not what I'm looking for.
So did you ever do any like ghost reviews for anybody?
No, I've never done any like mock reviewing or anything like that, which is a very, very lucrative thing to do. Like,
I know a number of people that have done that. Yeah.
Now, people at IGN, and I won't name any names because this was a long time ago at IGN, like many years ago. I don't think anyone even really, or many people are around from this era anymore, but it's like there were people that would write Brady and Prima guides under a pen name to get like the big payments, like $5,000 per guide. Right. And there were people that did mock review things, like these are unethical things, like there's no doubt about it. So it's like, it's not like this is a unique possibility here. It's like these things do happen. Now, the consulting that I've taken has basically been an entity that's either not game related at all or kind of tangentially game related. And what the situations I've been in have basically been like, we're going to ask you a ton of questions about video games. Like we need to understand like the games industry or the console industry or whatever. It's like so far removed from even a product that it's like, cool, I would do that. But if Capcom came to me and said, like, we want you to consult on the next Mega Man game, like, I'd have to have that conversation with the audience, or I would just turn it down, you know? But you can't just do that, because that's crossing the wires in a way that the audience needs to know. But I don't feel that way when, like, I was working with a company in Israel for a while that was making like some sort of gaming hub thing that was really like PC centric and all that. And they were just asking shit tons of questions on our meetings about things. And that was so I have no problem with people taking those kinds of gigs, but this isn't what was being suggested here. But Nick has an explanation for this, and this lines up with my own experience, so I want to read it. He says, quote, "The thing he's referring to here is a game that reached out with interest to our sponsor deck. But in our sales meeting with them, it became clear they didn't want to actually sponsor, but wanted help in finding a publisher for their game. Second Wind is not a publisher, nor are we in the business of consulting publishers on behalf of game developers. So in this case, I told them that I would be able to help them outside of Second Wind find a publisher as a consultant, and that's all there was to it. If that were to move forward, this game would not be covered on Second Wind, and they were made aware of that in the call that we had. The only game I've been paid to work on is Yahtzee's game, Starstruck Vagabond, and I've had 2 other developers reach out to me directly with express interest in having me consult on their project, but due to life being crazy, I have not had time to work on these projects, so I have signed no other contracts," end quote. I'm not crazy about this in some sense, but it's not really a big problem. And the specific thing I wanted to say from my own experience is that it isn't uncommon for people to ask you to connect them with publishers. Like, and they'll do it pretty brazenly, and it seems like they did it under false pretenses here and saying, like, we kind of want to get sponsored, then you get your FaceTime, then you say, actually, what we're looking for is a publisher. Nick trying to connect these guys with a publisher is, I don't know. I'm somewhat neutral on that. It's not something I would necessarily want to do in his situation. But as long as it's explicit that this game just basically, like, by doing this, your game will never be covered on our outlet, that's reasonable enough. And if that's kind of the course you're going forward, then I guess I don't really see the conflict, unless you're looking like several meta levels up where you're like, well, now you have a relationship with this publisher. You kind of helped them court, right? Now you have some ins there. Another game unassociated with that kind of trickles out of that tree. How do you treat that game? Reasonable question. Again, why I wouldn't put myself in that position, but I don't think that this is like him funneling people to paid consultations. It's not the way. This is not what the accusation sounded like in the video.
Right. And I think that's the nature of that video, is it's all kind of colored by this disagreement. Whether it's a personality clash or something greater, I don't know. But I understand from the description of events that Nick gave you how Frost could describe it that way. And I understand how Nick saying what he said would probably be largely okay. Although I think for all of this kind of brand of issue, I think mostly you can cleanse these with disclosure. And for something like this, if this is going to be your policy, we can connect people, but then you won't be covered, that maybe that requires a policy disclosure to your audience as well. But I can also understand why you wouldn't want to make that disclosure, because you don't really want to advertise that this is a way to get to publishers. So there's a number of things there. One of the reasons why you don't want to go down this road if you're Nick Calandra is that you don't want to have to get into these complicated questions, whether or not you have to disclose this to your audience or otherwise, whether or not Frost can say this about you later on. And maybe you want to have a more blanket, no, this is unacceptable. We'll take your sponsorship, but we can't otherwise help you. But if you are going to help in the way that at least Nick describes, right, this is only one side of the story, then I also don't have an issue with it, with the proviso that it means you're never going to be heard from again on Second Wind.
Yeah, right. It's, again, there are meta levels to it, and I get that. We'll just use Capcom as an example. Not that Nick is like helping Capcom find games. I think they're okay on themselves. But Nick makes the connection between a game and Capcom. And then he says that game can never be covered on Second Wind. But then Capcom releases Resident Evil 9. And Nick is friendly with the PR people and the marketing people. I mean, but then again, I was very friendly with the Sony people. Very friendly. Right? And very friendly with Bandai Namco, and very friendly with Square Enix, and very friendly with EA and Rockstar and all these different. So it's complicated because, like, over time, I've realized, and again, I said it earlier, that though I could never identify a time when I was objectively, actively, and knowledgeable and knowingly biased, there must have been subconscious moves that stayed my sword in some sense, or made a different decision or whatever, based on the more people you know. It's that's just human nature. That's kind of
I've often thought that about reviewers, right? Yeah. It's a different process for the raw consumer who's just finding a new disc in the store to say, I thought that sucked, rather than someone that actually did the preview and went and saw what the offices looked like and how the people were struggling to do the animations or what have you. That is one of the tougher things that we ask of reviewers, is to actually be close enough to know these people as people and then still separate from that to make the objective review. And so, yeah, I think from a human perspective, I understand you saying that there could be subconscious connections with people all throughout the industry. That makes perfect sense to me. I would imagine that you and anybody else that's trying to do their job well from a review perspective, try to tamp that down to the extent that you notice it, and review for your experience with the product as best you can.
It's also important to remember that PR people, and I like a lot of PR people, they were nice, they were truly good people, but their job is to manipulate you. Like, that is the job. Any other interpretation of what they're trying to do is inaccurate, and they're experts at it. And it's true that if you give a game a bad review or they don't agree with the game, the way the game was reviewed, they'll cut you off, and that has to play into it somehow. I remember I reviewed infamous Festival of Blood, which was the Infamous 2 expansion on PS3. And I wrote the review, and then Sucker Punch, through PR, contended that I was lying about how quickly I beat it, to the point where we had to take pictures of the trophy like for beginning and the trophy for beating the game, which was exactly 90 minutes between them, as I remember. And I said that the game took me 90 minutes. Like, here you go. So their whole job, when they don't like the outcomes, they will tell you. And I'm so happy to be away from that, because I didn't realize how freeing it was, but I understand people feel the pressure. It's like, I gotta be there day and date. No one's going to care what I think about Black Myth Wukong if I don't have something at the embargo. It's like, if that's true, then it's a you problem, Well,
you are seeing YouTube blow that up a little bit, right? Because you do have commenters and people that clearly don't have access that will deliver their buy it, don't buy it review a week or two later, and there's still an audience for that. So, I mean, I think, honestly, not to gild the lily too much, kind of funny, you guys going out and showing what personality-driven gaming media could look like was massively helpful to the coverage of these games in a lot of ways. Now, do I think that there are some grifters online at the same time? I do. But I think overall, people are able to find reviews that they trust, maybe even better than the old way.
I feel like it's funny, man, because you were brought up like kind of the conflicts of interest we kind of were perceived to have it kind of funny. And that was something that I often said too, and I only came to this conclusion later in my career, but there was this idea that if you took publisher money to promote a game, but then gave it a bad review or kind of a middling review or, blah, whatever, then it's like, see, I'm not on the take or whatever. And it's like, but isn't that just as unscrupulous in some way? Because you're basically taking a publisher's money and then not promoting it, right? Like, you're saying, like, I'm so honest that I'll take the publisher money and then shit on their game. And I'm like, that in and of itself is also unscrupulous. That's why you just don't want to be involved in any of this, kind of thing. And
I don't know whether it's unscrupulous. I do think it's the same kind of bias issue that you have, right? The person that wants to be, for internet parlance, the edgelord of taking publishing money would say, yeah, I'm going to give these things 5s or 6s to show how I'm the only honest broker on the internet. And that's the same version of bias, just in the other direction as anything else. Now, I don't think you actually get rid of bias entirely in the internet influencer commentator space, which we will talk about as part of our other conversations here in respect of legal and business issues in just a minute, because I do think there are issues of what a publisher allows you to do with your streams and your coverage of things, and what they won't allow you to do that basically can inform how you hear as an audience member any of your favorite commenters online. And so I think that there's a bigger conversation here about the entire structure of talking about video games, but not just video games, media in general, right? Because there are movie reviewers on YouTube or elsewhere that have similar issues that we'll see in the gaming industry.
There's some other stuff here that Nick says. The quote from Frost is, quote, trading positive press, positive reviews, and documentary opportunities without disclosing that publishers were paying for his trips, paying for the documentaries, and Nick was bargaining for future employment. This isn't stuff that only happened 6 years ago. This happened while we were at SWG and Escapist and every other outlet he worked at for the past 6 years, end quote. And Nick said,
future employment's the one that jumps out at me there, but
well, then he speaks to this specifically, so you'll be pleased about this. He says, quote, Nick says, quote, the only paid documentary we've worked on was for EVE Online, and that was announced and disclosed multiple times. We filmed the EVE FanFest documentary at the request of CCP Games and was released on their channel. While we were at FanFest, we also filmed a second documentary on the history of EVE that was not part of the paid deal and was released on The Escapist. Another documentary we did was on Sea of Stars, of which only travel was paid for because gamers wouldn't front the cost for it. The documentary itself was an Escapist project. This can be backed up by Omar Ahmed, who worked on every documentary with me since the Larian documentary. I don't know what future employment he's talking about, as I've only worked at The Escapist since 2018, and that was my first full-time job until Second Wind, end quote. So he does speak to that. I don't know if what Frost was saying was, again, the consultancy stuff or whatever in terms of employment. I don't know if that's what he meant. Again, really imprecise language on his part. But this, again, doesn't sound like anything worth having a public blow up over it, from, in my opinion. I will say about CCP, they are notoriously aggressive for coverage and will basically do anything to get you to go to Iceland. So, and I've been to Iceland, but not with them. So I did end up going to Iceland, and I didn't go to CCP when I was there, but they would invite you to FanFest, their big thing there in Reykjavik, every year. And I knew people that worked there. My friend Ryan Geddes, he worked at 38 Studios. He worked at IGN in the 38 Studios. And when they went down, he ended up at CCP and with Dust 514, which people might remember was the PlayStation 3 shooter that was associated with EVE. And we used to constantly be like, come out and see us. We'll come and see us. We'll bring out or whatever. And this and that and the other thing. So that EVE, that CCP would pay for someone to go to Reykjavik to film shit for them is the least surprising thing in the world to me. And I don't see, I don't know. There's nothing here for me on that thing.
My recollection is that description from Nick is at least correct to my understanding from the public side of things, which is to say, I remember the FanFest documentary being kind of promoted by Nick on social media, and it was as something that was essentially made by EVE. I can't speak to the rest, but certainly this is essentially just denying the future employment aspect of it, which is fine. I don't know what Frost meant by it. You called it imprecise language. I think that's right. Again, a lot of this video in terms of structure seems fueled by kind of personality driven. Look, Nick's such a bad guy that I don't know what to do with that. Is that imprecise? Is that hyperbole? Is that something else? Because I do think to the extent that you're using corporate opportunities to try to better your own personal situation or to fill your own pockets, that's where I start to look at, okay, that's a breach of not just ethics, but potentially fiduciary obligations to your entity. And so then I start to worry about it. Okay, you're trying to maneuver this opportunity that was really for your company, whether it's Escapist or Second Wind or anyone else, and make yourself better. That starts to look like what amounts to kind of ephemeral embezzlement. And so if he's saying that didn't happen or that he doesn't recall any time where he's had employment as an issue, I'm inclined to believe him, again, with the disclaimer that I've worked with him before, but I don't know what Frost was talking about there, which is a little bit concerning, right? Like that's just a blanket denial.
And then the only other thing here, because Nick said a few other things, but I don't think some of the stuff's even important for the purposes of what we're saying, because he gets later into some of the stuff about how he ended up as editor-in-chief with all that. And it's like, I don't want to go through your history. I'm not trying to defame your previous projects or whatever. That's not even the important part of it to me. But this Frost did say, quote, Nick trades good press coverage and holds back criticism in exchange for paid documentaries, trips, gear, and job opportunities. And a lot of his connections stem from his gaming mentory days. His staff at the time was not pleased when they found out. This recontextualized one of Nick's patterns of behavior. A lot of Nick's personal tastes and biases that he pushed on his staff for coverage or restricted them from criticizing led back to his PR connections. He was making deals behind the scenes without them knowing. I even found one where he threw in a positive review to sweeten the deal, offer flights, jobs, gifts, favors, documentary opportunities, none disclosed, end quote. And so Nick says this, quote, as editor-in-chief, I would often pitch ideas to writers, but I never forced anyone to do anything they explicitly did not want to do, nor have I pushed anyone to not criticize a product because of my own biases. Again, this can be backed up by editors that have worked with me. I and Yahtzee both received Valve indexes for coverage purposes. Jack and I have been sent meta quests for a sponsored project and organic coverage, a gaming chair, which was a sponsorship deal offered to the team first for sponsored projects, etc. None of this was tied to positive coverage in any form. So again, this kind of just gets into more of like crossing the wires when you don't really have to, or maybe you financially do feel like you need to kind of sustain your company. But by removing those, see, this is what I was saying earlier, Hoeg. It's like remove all of those connections and you just don't have these problems anymore because no one can level any of these accusations against you. To me, it's like Frost is making very generalized accusations when they should be very specified accusations. And so like, I'm kind of believing what Nick is saying here because he is denying it, but also it's like, why wouldn't you just be specific? You waste all of this time in the video talking about things that don't matter when you really could have spent the 28-minute runtime getting into the 3 specific things you leveled and the evidence you have for it. But saying things like, I don't want to say what game it is because I don't want to tie anyone back or whatever, like that's not sufficient, you know? Right.
And it makes it feel like you're just throwing mud at the wall.
Right.
And seeing what sticks. I agree with the video going out that's one of the issues that it has. I think that explanation from Nick again makes sense. I don't know whether or not there's something bigger there because it is closer to a blanket denial than some of the other stuff that he said. But as an editor in chief, I think you're always kind of picking and choosing what direction you want your outlet to go with various things. And so I think it could be the case that someone that sees that you have certain PR connections or other potential ethics conflicts could say you're making these choices because of your connections and for future pecuniary gain when it doesn't feel that way to you. So this again looks more like a disconnect between strategy and personality to me than a legal or ethical issue at Second Wind. But I am not hearing either from Frost or Nick what might be the specific problem as you identified, Colin. So I can't speak to it more than that. I just think that a lot of these issues seem to stem from not liking how Nick feels about certain things or operates on social media or otherwise, and then trying to tie it back to what could be a more problematic ethical breach.
Yeah, it just seems, and that's what I was saying earlier when I presented Nick with the quotes that I was curious about. They all kind of just went to the same idea of the quid pro quo, the kind of unsavory PR connections, funneling things from one to the other, but there's just no specificity. And it's not that we're in the court of law or anything like that, as you well know, but it's like, you need to see the evidence at some point. You have the right to like confront the evidence, you know, like in some sense, if it was a court of law. And I just think it seems, and this is what I was saying to Nick, I'm like, this seems somewhat, if I'm to believe Nick, and I just, on balance, I do, whether or not Nick's just lying to my face or whether or not things are being, I have no idea. Like,
it's always a possibility.
Right. But I don't think so. And it's just, on balance, I don't really understand the point of all of this because it's so imprecise that it almost seems intentionally so to kind of muddy things and poison the well, which I'm not crazy about. So if like there is something here and you felt like you needed to go public with it, then I think it's like, well, what is it? You know, and if not, I was saying to Nick, I'm like, well, I wonder if you have any recourse. Like this person, if what you're saying is true, then this person's lying, right, about you. And is that somehow
the thing
actionable?
About this particular interaction between Frost and Nick is it doesn't feel to me like either is really lying. It feels like there's a difference in perspective as to what was happening. And so even Frost, yes, he goes out there with a fairly angry video, and you could argue that he's trying to burn the bridge / burn Second Wind to the ground as part of all this. And that might make you upset if you're Nick. I don't see, because of that imprecision, right? You don't have the obvious lies, maybe the employment one, but that's probably not enough in and of itself. And so I think Frost makes that video from a kind of smart perspective to say, all right, I'm going to throw all this mud at the wall, but you can't get me. I'm the gingerbread man, because who knows what I'm talking about on half this stuff. And from Nick's perspective, that's annoying, but this is the nature of internet drama to some extent, which is to say, yeah, you go out there with this crap and there's no real great way to defend yourself. And that's unfortunate, but you probably don't want to drag anybody to court or try any of that because it's super expensive and lawyers are annoying, as you know, if you're watching this video. And you probably aren't going to win at the end of the day anyway, because we have very strong freedom of speech rules in the United States.
Yeah, that's where my mind was too. And just talking to you so many times now about that stuff, it always seems like it would just be very hard to have anything actionable there. But it's like, to me, it seems like maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle, but it does seem inherently that at least with some of this stuff, that's one of these people has to be framing things dishonestly, in my opinion. Like,
I think it can, to the extent there's a platonic objective truth about these things, one can be closer to wrong than right. But from a legal perspective, I'm not seeing a lot of stuff that you can definitively say, yes, that is a lie. That is a deliberate, intentional falsehood designed to harm this person. And so from a legal perspective, I have to say, yeah, you probably don't want to pay for going through the legal process to have someone tell you that.
Right. Yeah. And I would agree. I wonder where it goes from here, because I do feel like I need to say, and maybe I should have said this at the top, is that I didn't reach out to this Frost person for multiple reasons. Number one, it shouldn't really matter, but I don't know him. So there's that. Although I don't really care about that. I don't know a lot of people and I still reach out to them. But there's a bigger thing that I feel like he's already said his piece. Now we're like in a reactionary stance where we have to figure out, and I did the legwork of getting the answers as to what Nick feels about some of these accusations. And I feel like that adds something to the story. In other words, I feel like Frost has said his piece. I don't feel like Nick really did say his piece. So now we have both of those things, and whether there's another round of this between them, I just didn't want to exacerbate it such that I was farming the drama. Rather, I wanted to disassociate from it and find answers to it. And I feel like alerting both sides and then getting involved in all that, I just feel like would have been a very messy thing. And I'm not trying to farm this. So,
well, and we started this conversation about Nick not talking about this online, at least publicly, without this answer to you. And I think it wouldn't surprise me if the business strategist or the legal counsel or anyone in between for Second Wind says the best answer to any of this is basically now to not reference it again, to not pretend that it exists. I think Nick and Second Wind put out like a series of statements from the other founders that basically backed Nick up on this. And I would suspect that's probably the end of the story from the Second Wind Group side, or at least somebody's going to recommend that be the end of the story for them. You never know what schools are going to do. But I think the strategic right move is probably to quiet down about it from now. Yeah,
I will say, to be fair, that the collective kind of conversation with all of the founders and the employees kind of releasing that collective statement, it was a little muted. Like, it wasn't, no one was, from my perspective, no one wrapped their arms around Nick and shielded him from any of the things. Some of them said like, oh, maybe this, and this, but there was a lot of maybe buts or ends, and this is the way we feel about things. So at the very least, I feel like the neutrality of it does benefit Nick and the stance there, because if there was, it seemed almost like part of this was to foment some sort of internal revolution or whatever, or civil war that they seem to be resisting. I mean, I feel like that, from my perspective, was somewhat obvious. It's to like carve some of these people. It appears to be a bridge burning kind of solution to Mr. Frost's problem. And again, I don't know him any better than you do, Colin, and I don't know his story. I've seen some of his videos in the past. He did one for Second Wind called Cold Takes, which is a clever play on words for his name and hot takes on the internet. So I like that. I like plays on words, but that notwithstanding, I do think, it was trying to bring some sort of a significant change to Second Wind Group, and it does appear that has been resisted. All right. We've spent a lot of time on that. I don't want to keep you too much longer. There are a couple other things I want to discuss, and we can do this more quickly, of course. IGN reports, and this has been circulating and making a lot of noise, which I think is worth discussing, because I think that there's probably a reason to make some noise about this. They write, Black Myth Wukong marketing team offers content creators a Steam key, but bans feminist propaganda and all talk of COVID. And they write, quote, an email sent from the Black Myth Wukong marketing team tells content creators they must not include feminist propaganda or use what are called trigger words, such as COVID-19. The email, which hit social media after it was sent to a number of content creators by a representative of Chinese games company Hero Games, was verified by IGN over the weekend via a source who asked not to be named. It includes a Steam key to pre-download the game on PC ahead of the Black Myth Wukong release date of August 20th. That's the day we're recording this. And a link to a Google document that outlines the do's and don'ts for content creators who intend to cover Black Myth Wukong during its August launch period. There is just one entry in the do's category: enjoy the game. However, there are 5 entries in the don'ts category reproduced below. Quote, do not insult other influencers or players. Do not use any offensive language or humor. Do not include politics, violence, nudity, feminist propaganda, fetishization, and other content that instigates negative discourse. Do not use trigger words such as quarantine or isolation or COVID-19. Do not discuss content related to China's game industry policies, opinions, news, etc. So IGN confirmed this. I mean, it shouldn't be a huge surprise, but I know people that got this as well. An interesting thing to note here is that this seems to have gone strictly to streamers and influencers and not critics, because the critics that I talked to did not get this as part of their code.
Yeah, I'm on the Bitcast with Travis Northrup, who currently consults for and does freelance reviews for IGN. And he said that the journalist version of this was also a bit weird, but not the same kind of weird.
So what are your thoughts on this? Let me say this, Hoeg, before you even start, is that it's worth noting that this kind of stuff comes with many games, but it's usually asking you not to spoil things. So a game will say, like, here's the code, here's the information, and some art. And we would appreciate if you didn't capture any footage after chapter 3, that you didn't show this character, that you don't acknowledge this particular thing, and so on and so forth. Reasonable asks. That like one hand washes the other kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, you're giving me access. In return, I'm not going to spoil it. That's basically usually what it is. This kind of thing is well above anything that I ever personally dealt with. So what do you think?
Yeah, this strikes me as an entity that is not used to dealing with PR, or at least international PR, right? I mean, I think it's important to note that this is a Chinese company operating in China that I believe this is their first game. And so I don't know whether they're using an international PR consulting firm or not, but I think that's a part of this story here, which is to say, all right, we're going to go tell streamers things that we have been concerned about from streaming, right? You talk about trigger words, you talk about Chinese policies, and immediately what comes into mind is like the kind of free Hong Kong stuff that happened with Hearthstone and stuff that if you're in China, you might be fully aware of and you don't want to have happen with your game. You don't want any of those stories. Now, of course, by doing it this way, you get all the stories on the ask rather than the actual event. And that's not what you want either, but maybe you're just new to this, or maybe you're doing your own PR and that's what happens here. And so I look at this and say, it seems informed by areas of sensitivity that they might have to the way influencers and streamers have talked about other things related to China, not related to China. I think feminist propaganda is the really weird one there, right? Not only because it's weird in of itself, but just the phrase, like the lawyer wants that defined, right? I'm sorry, what do you mean by feminist propaganda, right? I think everybody has an idea of what that might mean and what certain people in the culture war might position it as. But I actually don't know what you mean when I'm entering into some kind of contractual relationship with you, which at some level this is, right? You're getting consideration, you're getting a game, and you're giving consideration by agreeing to these various embargo or prohibition rules for your access to that game. So I think that's important. The other thing I want to say about this is that we talk a lot on my channel in Virtual Legality about this notion of largesse, which is to say that streaming video games have not been definitively shown to not be copyright infringement in basically any jurisdiction. I know a lot of people on the internet want to say, well, it's transformative and you're playing it and you're adding your own special whatever to the video game, and so it's not an infringement, it's a fair use, all these various things. That is a difficult argument to win in the long run, and either way, it has not been won yet. There's no court in America or other jurisdiction that I'm familiar with that has determined that it is in fact transformative or fair use or anything like that. So for the most part, in video game land, you're putting up videos on Twitch or YouTube Live or wherever else you're putting them at the largesse, at the beneficence of the publisher, right? That you are probably infringing on their copyright and they're not going to do anything about it because they think it's selling video games for them. Mm-hmm. You are useful to them. And so they aren't going to give you a copyright strike or otherwise make your life a problem unless you do something that they don't like. And so I do think that this informs how you should view streams about Black Myth Wukong even after this, even if the streamer says they bought it themselves and they're not subject to the embargo, because everybody now knows what it is that would make game science upset, right? And that is going to be not just subconsciously, but probably consciously in the back of the heads of people that are talking about this game. I am not going to talk about these various things, or they're going to strike my channel, and this is the way I make my money and feed my family. And that happens all over the place with respect to largesse and intellectual property pursuits. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to put this together with the modding conversation we're going to have, because it's an important part of understanding what you're getting from streamers and influencers, which is that they have to acknowledge that if they were to say something that the publisher really dislikes, that they might be putting their entire channel in their hands. And we've seen this before. We've seen instances where someone that streams Madden, for instance, got called out because he was saying something that Electronic Arts didn't like, and they struck him. And because there's archives of all these videos, you can strike him the 3 times and get him off there pretty quickly. And that was said to not be a problem because he's been streaming for 2 years or 3 years or something. And I've covered this on my channel. And all I could tell people was that they really are streaming in an infringing category. And Twitch operates basically in total infringement category for the most part, based on the premise that the publishers like to get this as advertising. And you have to always worry about these things. So when I see an embargo like this, it's not just that it's weird. It's not just that it's oddball to reference things like feminist propaganda and Chinese gaming policies, because you kind of understand where they're coming from as a Chinese company, at least with why they'd want that. What worries me is that in the future, for a game that appears to be this popular based on things like the Steam database, we have to take with a grain of salt everything that anybody would tell us that's streaming this particular product in the future.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about this, because I feel like there is some sort of knowledge of the Western gaming market just in the way games are covered in the West, simply from not sending this specific verbiage to critics, where I think there would have been more pushback. For instance, I know that there was a major pushback. There used to be this thing where embargoes sometimes would be set after the game was released, and they'd give you the game like, a month early, but it's like, you can't write anything until 12 hours after the game comes out. And eventually people started saying no, because it's like, we're not doing this. And some of the outlets even started kind of talking to each other about the way we would pursue, this was a long time ago, the way we would pursue some of these embargo asks. And so things started to get a lot softer. And then you started getting what were called review guides instead, which was basically just like, here's how the game plays. This is what we would ask you to ignore. And they would not really get into anything else. It's strange to me that China is so sensitive still about the origins of COVID-19, which originated in a Chinese lab, in case you guys have been hiding under a rock by this point. That they don't want you to talk about quarantine, isolation, or COVID-19 in August of 2024. Like, why would that even come up? Like, see, that to me is a weird thing to just include. No one was going to mention COVID in their review of Black Myth Wukong. And then the discussion of the do not discuss content related to China's game industry policies, opinions, views, etc. This is a circular ask, in my opinion, because they're basically asking you not to acknowledge the very nature of the asks that are in the PR materials. So I just found it's funny that you clue into like the feminist propaganda and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, yeah, that's fucking weird. But the weirder part is that it's just basically self-referential in some sense. It's like,
well, that might not be as unusual to me, because like one of the standard terms in an NDA, for instance, is part of the materials you're not allowed to disclose is the nature and subject of this NDA. So that doesn't kind of shock my conscience for, you also shouldn't talk about this stuff. And I do think it's worthwhile to note that this became public and a lot of people confirmed that this was true. And I think one of the more popular streams of the game today is essentially called like feminist propaganda COVID stream. And I think that's an interesting reaction that you could probably have anticipated if you understand the gamer and Western streamer mindset on these things. But again, it does strike me as kind of amateurish, or not really thinking through how this will be perceived by people. And that's kind of the story to me on that. It's
funny. People always assume or ask me like, oh, you must have been under NDAs all the time and stuff like that. And I'm like, no, very rarely. I remember the specific times I signed things because it was unusual. If I was led into a studio, it's like, you can't talk about anything you see here, or I remember if you would get a game from Rockstar, they would often make you sign personal NDAs. But then I realized, and I don't know if there's a word for this or if this is if this even washes with you, that the presumption I think was that our bosses were under like these like company-wide NDA agreements with publishers for like broad-based access that kind of trickled down to us. So the assumptions were made that we were kind of all collectively under this agreement with someone from the company signing. And I was just never privy to that shit. But who knows how legally binding any of that stuff was, you know?
Yeah. And certainly in California, there's open questions about employment contracts and all of their provisions. But the standard way to handle that for a big entity like IGN would be to, yes, have the executives have entered into the requirement that they keep IGN's information confidential, and IGN's information would then be defined to include confidential or otherwise proprietary information it receives from third parties. And then those contracts that the entity would have with something like a publisher would have as a requirement within their terms something that says your employees and consultants and whoever else you're going to give access to this to have the equivalent protection in their contracts. So your employment contract would have either had as a term that you agree to keep all of IGN's information confidential as defined in somewhere else, or would have a separate appendix that by signing the employment agreement, you have agreed to sign the appendix NDA that puts you in the same spot as IGN proper. And I can't tell you that they did it that way. I can't tell you that that's the way that it would be enforced properly in California. I can tell you that that is the way these things tend to be structured in large organizations.
Yeah, because I felt like I'm like, why doesn't anyone make me sign anything? And then I realized like they didn't care. I was already covered, I guess, in some sense. So yeah, I know this has been circulating. I find this very peculiar. This goes into, again, the beaten fucking dead horse at this point of just not communicating or having relationships with the game industry. And then you don't really need to worry about any of this stuff. Just buy the game and you're free and clear of all of their asks. But it's worth noting that I think this is going to become more pronounced, especially the last two bullet points of trigger words, quarantine and COVID, and then the stuff about China and the game industry there and their politics and all the rest. I've said publicly, because I was not proud of it, but it is what happened, is that in the PlayStation ecosystem terms for publishing games, it explicitly asks you not to say anything about like China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, shit like that. And this isn't, as far as we can tell, in the other, like Nintendo, Microsoft, Steam, I guess, are the other places that we would release our games at Lilymo. It's not in there. So we self-flagged ourselves in, and I know some people know this story, but just to put a point on it, in Super Perils of Baking, it's all written in rhyme and verse. And I wrote the enemy bestiary, and there's a toaster enemy. And I wrote how it was made in a Chinese factory for like $1 a day or something like that. And the rhyme was about Taiwan being a country or something like that. Like it was some funny, stupid thing. It was just a totally throwaway line. People are like, why is that even in there? And I'm like, it was just supposed to be like an Easter egg. It was supposed to just be stupid and kind of show my politics a little bit or whatever, how I feel about the situation. And we removed it. No one asked us to. We were just like, we know in good conscience that this is against the terms. I don't think we would get in trouble because people publish all sorts of crazy shit on Sony all the time. And I think they'll just ask you to edit it or remove it or whatever. I don't think they would make a problem for you. But we were like, is this worth us getting potentially blacklisted from PSN where we sell 70% of our games or whatever? And we made that decision and we self-regulated on that. And it's not that wasn't removed from the other versions of the games. So it's only the PlayStation version that doesn't have that rhyme in it or that verse. And I'm not proud of it, but I told everyone that we were doing it even before the game came out and explained to them that, first of all, it's not my company. I own a minority share of it. So it's not really my choice. And we need to sell the game. So we have to do what we have to do to stay safe within the boundaries. Sometimes you have to make these choices, but to explicitly say that kind of thing on a game by game basis, I have a bigger problem with it. And it's like, do not include politics, violence, nudity. It's even the feminist propaganda, fetishizations like that. All that stuff's weird. Like your game is violent. The game is political, isn't it? Based on a real Chinese myth, like a well,
it's based on the novel Journey to the West,
right? So I guess not explicitly political. And then the other thing I thought was interesting is like, do not use any offensive language or humor. It's like, fuck yourself. Like what? Who are you to tell someone how to talk about your product? Like put it out with a little confidence or don't put it out at all. Very weird. I guess what I'm saying is that kind of stuff, especially the last two bullet points, but all of it comes off as like, we have to say this. I guess that's something I just wanted to put out there, is them not necessarily holding anyone, but being like, our minders are kind of watching.
I wouldn't be surprised if there is no enforcement mechanism either that happens or is intended as part of this, but it does put it into people's brains. Should I say this? Should I not say this? Right? Even as something as innocuous as your toaster verse is like, once you've got it in the streamers' heads that they might come after you for X, Y, or Z, they have to take that into account because people are making their livelihood by streaming you video games and things. And because of the way the DMCA operates, these platforms basically have to cut off people that hit a certain number of strikes. And so that's been set at essentially 3 strikes because of baseball, as best I can tell.
Right.
But these platforms do that so that they can avoid liability on their own. And that's the way the structure is written. I think the DMCA should probably be re-examined for various reasons. But influencers, streamers, commentators, game streamers in general have to worry about that when they see stuff like this. When you, at bare minimum, you think now Game Science is crazy, or their publisher is crazy, or the Chinese government is crazy, you have to take that into account about what you're streaming and what you say on that stream.
So we're at 2-ish hours here, 2 hours, 5 minutes. Do you want to skip one of these future topics, or should we go through all of them? What's your time look like?
I'm good. I mean, I can keep talking for a time now.
Okay, great. All right. So we'll take our time with this. I don't know that I have too much more to say about the Wukong situation. I did want to acknowledge it. I mean, it's unsavory, but I think you said it very well. Like, this could just be playing ball and fulfilling the cultural and political expectations of your environment, understanding full well that it doesn't matter once it's out there and you can't really do much about it. And like, what is game science is going to have any retaliatory? This is part of the problem about being your self-publisher, is like your ability to do anything about someone breaking your embargo or whatever is limited. It's almost one of the advantages, the back end advantages of hiring PR firms, like independent PR firms to hawk your games, is if you fuck over that game, they'll remember that for all of the games they cover. But if you're doing it yourselves, then you have really no power over them. Something to consider. Although I like the self-publishing thing. And I just can't believe how big the game is.
Yeah, certainly the sales and the numbers that are coming out right now give them more power than they might have thought they had.
It's really, really interesting. All right. Let's see here. 2 more. I guess the story is somewhat associated, or at least you were saying so. So there was this Modern Warfare remastered mod called H2 Multiplayer Mod, H2M Mod, or H2M. And, quote, aims to recreate the original Modern Warfare 2 multiplayer experience with new twists. The mod features a wide variety of maps, new progression, unique camos, remastered weapons, custom attachments, and more. The original Modern Warfare 2 kill streaks make a return as well, completely changing the way Modern Warfare Remastered feels and plays. So PC Games N wrote, classic Modern Warfare 2 multiplayer mod shut down by Activision day before launch. And the story reads, quote, in part, the mod in question is called H2, and it essentially remakes the multiplayer experience from the original Modern Warfare 2 inside the PC version of Call of Duty Modern Warfare Remastered. I know that seems a little bit confusing, but Modern Warfare Remastered already has online multiplayer support to build upon. On top of recreating all the original Modern Warfare 2 maps, H2 is also going to incorporate all of the maps from Modern Warfare Remastered and create some new unique maps using its assets. The FPS games mods would also introduce a fresh progression system, dynamic camos, and much more. And fans were apparently really amped about this. I didn't realize like how big it was. People were super excited about it. And actually Modern Warfare Remastered itself saw a massive spike of players right before it was supposed to release, as people were getting kind of their feet wet and preparing.
And I think there was a big sale during that period of time.
Right.
I'm not positive about that, but I think there was a sale on the price.
And they say here, so the team that made the mod said, quote, we're hit with a cease and desist. And they said, quote, today our team members received a cease and desist order on behalf of Activision Publishing in relation to the H2M mod project. We are complying with this order and shutting down all operations immediately and permanently. End quote. The H2 website has now disappeared. Its bio on X now reads shut down, and the mod will no longer be released. I wonder what that letter said about what they were going to do to them. So
yeah, I mean, it said something along the lines of, please govern yourselves accordingly at the end. But if you haven't received a cease and desist letter before, consider yourself lucky and good. They tend to be pretty high level as to what possible bad things might happen to you if you continue on your course of action. It doesn't mean that you can't fight it necessarily. God knows, in the land of corporate law, we've sent out cease and desists we didn't think would stop whatever was going to happen, and we have discounted ones that we've received that we thought were in the wrong. But in this particular instance, these guys felt that Activision had a good enough case that they shut it all down.
So what do you make of this? This is part of a pattern of things that bother me about people working on other IP that they don't own, but at the same time introducing a level of confusion about what people are allowed to do to games, because I thought that modding was an accepted part of PC gaming culture, including on Steam. And obviously mods have been migrating through Bethesda games primarily to even PlayStation, but certainly to Xbox before that. I'm confused about the intersection, like the nexus of these two things, because this doesn't seem as quick and obvious as all the Nintendo shit I always make fun of, where it's like, I'm making Pokemon, Black or whatever. Oh, there is a Pokemon Black, I guess. I'm making Pokemon whatever. And it's like, why? Or the person that made the Metroid remake, the Metroid Prime or the Metroid Super Metroid remake or whatever it was, or Metroid 2. And the people that made like a Kirby game recently, and the guys that made the Bloodborne kart game. And it's like, I don't understand why you think you're going to get away with this, or why you're putting so much time and effort and clear talent into something that will never take off. But then I see something like this and I'm like, I thought that in the PC space, like fucking with shit was okay. And so there's something about this I don't understand. And so I'm hoping
you say okay from a cultural perspective. The reason I wanted to talk about this with the Wukong statement is because we get back to largesse, right? There is no question that taking existing maps and assets and up-resing them or adapting them or translating them to a new engine, to a new video game executable is a derivative work under copyright laws. And so for folks to understand copyright, when you create something and you put it in what the law calls a tangible medium, which includes ones and zeros on a disk or in the internet, then you are the sole owner of that intellectual property. And then you have the right to, among other things, reproduce, distribute, and create derivative works from that property. So when you made Modern Warfare 2 the first time at Activision, you have the rights to control that intellectual property for a period of time. It's 95 years at this point for corporations, which we can definitely have that conversation about it being too long at some point. That was extended a couple of times for Disney, primarily. But you have that control. And then when someone comes in and tries to adapt it without your permission, you can say that they're infringing your copyright. And the way the Copyright Act works is if they willfully infringe, which you would say that is self-evident if they're copying the map design from an existing property of yours, then you can go after some real big damages from them if they put it out. So in answer to your question on the copyright and modding, yes, it's socially acceptable in the PC space, and developers and publishers in the PC space have desired modding because it tends to add to the longevity and value of their products, right? You look at something like Skyrim, and just like streaming is helpful for advertising, most of these publishers have come around to the notion that it is helpful. But especially if a company wants to sell some version of what a mod presents, they do send cease and desist, they do squash these various efforts because they want to sell into that market. And so one could imagine that Activision has plans at some point in the future to release the Modern Warfare 2 maps at some point, although that isn't even a requirement of theirs. They just have the right to create derivatives. And so they can come after somebody that does something like this. In answer to your first question, which is why do people work in this space at all? I think one reason is kind of evidenced by your notion that they show real talent in some of these projects, which is to say, doing it under an intellectual property banner that people are actually going to notice comes out on the market, which is very saturated, is a potential way to get your name out there as someone that does good work on these things. Weren't the folks that made, I can't remember which Sonic the Hedgehog it was, but Generations or one of the pixel-based Sonic the Hedgehogs, really making fan Sonics?
Yeah, that's right. That's true.
Picked up by Sega.
That's right. Yep, that is true.
So I think that's part of the dream kind of process for folks that work on these projects. And I think they're legitimate fans of the underlying material, right? So fan fiction exists obviously for fans of literature and TV shows, and they write scripts and things like that. This is the same, but in video games, and it's more obviously an intellectual property infringement in certain ways because you can't claim fair use of just the entire Sonic the Hedgehog character or the assets that went into making a video game. And so I think it's one of those areas where, as a lawyer, if you sat in my office across from my desk and said, should I make this Sonic the Hedgehog offshoot? I would say, why don't you make Pete the Porcupine and call it the day and say inspired by Sonic the Hedgehog, and you're going to get a better chance of getting out there and making yourself some money. And if they say they don't want to do that, then, the client is king on these sorts of things. But I also understand people that say, I want to work in the actual environment, even if I know that I might get a cease and desist later on, because much like, let's say, a violation of the speed limit where you're operating illegally for a time, if there isn't a state trooper around, if there isn't Nintendo in the bushes, if Activision doesn't notice that you're out there, then you might just get it out there. You might even be able to sell it, depending on what it is that you're putting out there, without them noticing. And then, you infringe their copyright, but if they don't care, why should you? Right. And so I think people do come to that kind of realpolitik position on these kinds of things, even though the lawyer would sit there and tell you, no, it's definitely infringement, but you have to ask yourself what kind of risk you're willing to take.
It's interesting that I never really considered, because I'm not a PC person, as people know. Like, I just don't care about PC games, and that. So you hear a lot about modding, and you see a lot of mods, and we always talk about the PlayStation games coming to PC have been so funny because of the way people have fucked with them, especially in the Sad Dad simulators, where it's like you can make those so funny by just changing out the models and doing really stupid shit. But I guess there's a difference between the companies that lean into providing the tools and the access actively, so a Bethesda or an id, and then who I think regularly both hire from their communities wisely as they see talent. And it's probably a great way to actually just percolate that kind of talent and figure it out and mature it. And then there is a difference between just being able to mod a game, but not necessarily being, so like a game is on PC and thus you can mod it nonetheless, even though they would prefer you didn't or you weren't supposed to or whatever. And there's I guess a fundamental difference between those two things because it seems so culturally relevant to PC games.
I think for the most part, your Steam subscriber agreements and your various end user license agreements are going to say you're not going to mess with the code here. But yes, culturally, folks do, obviously. And for the most part, that's okay because publishers want you to do that. I mention largesse again because one of the screeds that I have on my channel so often is that I would prefer for streamers and modders and maybe even fan creators in certain instances to essentially have negotiated for or received the legal right to do these things because people are putting their hearts and souls in these projects. They don't know that this is all under the largesse of a large corporation that could take it away in a second. And so I would rather have these licenses say things like, yes, you can stream, and yes, you can mod, or various versions of that. And there are some that do, right? There is one that I bring up a lot on my channel. The Minecraft license is very specific about being able to stream and make fan creations out of Minecraft materials. And I tend to like that language as an example of how this could be written without kind of defeating all of the intellectual property held by a publisher. But a lot of these publishers basically take the default rule of this is all infringement, streaming is infringement, modding is infringement, and the sword of Damocles will hang over your head until we deign to have it fall on you. And that's just up to us.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I'm totally obsessed with my own lack of intrinsic feel for this particular topic because it's not a thing in my space, Well,
I think the largesse extends so far, right, that you would not look askance at anybody who says modding's legal, streaming's legal. What are you talking about, Hoeg? It's like, no, the reason strikes exist, the reason cease and desist letters go out on this kind of stuff is because those publishers, those IP holders are still in the right legally, and they know it and their lawyers know it, and they just allow other people to not be compliant with the law because it is helpful to them. And I think that's a disadvantageous position for a lot of game fans to be in connection with these things.
I'm fascinated too by the extent that people or entities will go to get footage and to retaliate in some way. You're seeing that with the Olympics and the Australian breakdancer where they're really like, I don't know if people are like manipulating the videos enough now where like they're not getting scrubbed and all of that. It's so funny. It's like, wow, you could be quite militant if you want to be with this stuff, even on a platform like X that is. So I can only imagine how bad it is on YouTube or on Instagram or wherever. Well, they'll do anything for content.
Well, the IOC is known for that, right? I think it was XQC. I don't know all the streamers by heart that was streaming Olympic events and said, whatever, sue me, and they struck him. I mean, like the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, is known for being very, very strict about the video representations of the Olympics. They are the equivalent of Nintendo and their intellectual property for video media. So there are always companies that have different sensitivities towards these things. When you were talking about the embargo before and not spoiling things, I was reminded of things like the Atlas Persona embargo rules, which were which are always opaque because Persona is such a weird series anyway, but it's like you won't show any content after August 15th in the calendar of the game and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, I wonder what happens after that. And so Japanese companies in general have a different culture than Western publishers, and they have a different feel for when streaming should be allowed at all.
It's funny, man, that the review guides have gotten so explicit with what they want and don't want that they just spoil the games now. I don't know if you've seen them where part of a review, it will say like all big red text, like beyond this point are spoilers. And it's like all the shit they don't want you to show. It's funny, but yeah, you're right. Like we exist in this gray area of acceptability. It's what sports experience on YouTube, like MLB, NFL, NHL, NBA, where that footage is much more similar to the Olympics, much more readily pursued, where it makes it difficult for people to do what we do with games for sport or something like that, which is a bummer.
Yeah, I think the sole sports video I used scans of screenshots that I had taken because that was the cleanest way of not offending anybody that owned the NFL rights. So it is one of those things that people in our space have to constantly think about, and that people that are just consuming streaming services probably don't think about as much and think, hey, all this must be legit, or else how could Amazon own Twitch, as a for instance?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it's logical. It's a total tangent and aside, but it's crazy to me that the sports leagues don't realize that they should liberate their footage like as much as possible. Like there's nothing. It's so weird, you know. And I think a lot of it is to protect their network partners and all of the rest, which is shitty. All right, postscript, all about AI. Over at gamesindustry.biz, they write SAG-Aftra set to hold second picket tomorrow. Now, this was written almost a week ago, so this is a little old now, but nothing has been resolved. So they write the Screen Actors Guild, American Federation of Television Radio Artists, is set to hold its second picket tomorrow. And it says, quote, SAG-Aftra, and this is from the organization itself, SAG-Aftra is striking this contract so that members working in interactive media, video games, in parentheses, can continue earning a living doing the job that they love. Our members' work and likenesses are being exploited by artificial intelligence, and video game companies have refused to offer a fair deal that addresses this existential threat, end quote. What do you think of this? Is this going to become a real focal point of what's going on in our industry? Is in the short to midterm, performance capture isn't really interrupted because that stuff's done so early, with the exception of pickups in a development kind of cycle. But in the long term, this can become a huge problem and cause a gap, not unlike the TV writer strike gap back in the day and all of the rest. I wonder if you think this is going to become a bigger issue.
Yeah, we're in a bit of a writer's strike gap right now from the most recent writer's strike. Yeah, I do think it's going to be a big issue. I think this is actually a place where I think the issue is more acute than some of the other things we've seen in the past. So I think voice acting in particular is going to be the first real creative endeavor that is going to be massively disrupted by AI. I don't know if you've worked with any AI companies at this point, Colin. No. I work with an AI company that helps with my podcast descriptions and whatnot that I really like. But one of the things they showed me, based just on my archive of materials, was what kind of commercial spot they could write for me and have me perform without my participation. Right. So they could prompt an AI spot and then they could have Rick Hoeg's voice give a spot. And because they were trying to find things that wouldn't necessarily match with my channel, they had me advertising for vodka. And it is a very effective thing right now. The AI systems can do voice acting very, very well. And certainly for any voice actor that has a large library out there, I think it's a legitimate concern that companies are going to want to automate voice acting, even more than motion capture and other aspects that are probably a little bit more down the line of what AI can achieve. So I think it's legitimate on their side to be concerned about this. Certainly unions at the writer's side and various other aspects of creative pursuits have been concerned about this in other areas outside of interactive media. Do I think they will win the day? I don't know. This is always a function of leverage. And I do think that video game developers can at some level say that the actors are not bringing the people to the seats as they are in movies and television. And so that's going to deleverage their position a little bit. But I think the voice actors and motion caption actors will also be able to say that video games in the modern era in 2024 and beyond can't exist without them. So I think it's a bit of a loggerheads, and it's really hard to say exactly how that'll go when you're not sitting in the negotiating room judging for yourself.
Well, if there's no legal protections for the things that they do, as far as, especially using generative AI to work off of source material to create new things, or whatever, that are inspired in a mechanized way by real things, then I guess the only way to fight back in the long term is for the companies to continue to do the right thing. And I just don't think that that's going to be reasonable. It reminds me of, I was listening to, I like the All In podcast, very popular podcast. I like those guys. They were talking about automation and how, and they were talking about value proposition, that ultimately the rubber hits the road with a value proposition. And I think they were talking about Starbucks specifically, where Starbucks has hit this, and they've had like huge executive upheaval or whatever, because they've hit this wall where they just simply cannot extract more value out of the product. They can't charge anymore. And now they need to cut costs. And they were saying, like, the reality is you're going to cut costs with personnel. And I don't see why, unfortunately, the machinery of capitalism won't show publishers and developers, we could kind of just not use these people at all. And I feel so shallow and hopeless and dystopian and fucking weird, but it's just more natural destruction of people's jobs with technologies and AI. And I was talking to my dad about this, actually. He was here last weekend, where I'm like, I can't quite put into words why I'm so protective of creative and humanities driven jobs being erased by computers, when, and I think it's a totally valid argument against it. That's like, well, you didn't care about all this other shit. Why do you care about this? And it's like, yeah, that's fair. I think we're kind of erasing our humanity at some point, but I didn't care when computers took over this job or AI made this job trivial or whatever. It's true. And so I've had a really hard time putting my own stake in the ground about how exactly I feel about all of this. Like, I have this very visceral, guttural, anti-AI feeling, but it's like, nonetheless, what's real, and like, how is this really going to go? And it has nothing to do with self-preservation, because I've already heard AI versions of myself, and it is completely convincing. People make them and send them to us. Crazy. And I don't think that stuff's going to erase my job. What I don't like is that it's possible, but what am I supposed to do about it? You can't stop it. You can't stop progress. It's like nuclear. It's like getting rid of all the nuclear weapons. It's like, that's never going to happen, unfortunately, because the technology exists, and so someone's going to have it, and so everyone's got to have it. And
Hideo is sad.
I know he is for lots of reasons. So,
oh no.
So I don't. In my opinion, I just don't quite know exactly where I stand on this, because I feel like there's an internal contradiction with me. I feel like there's like this inexorable march forward that is what it is. I feel like a lot of people simply don't give a shit. I feel like if companies can say, like, we'll cut prices of games, like games have been like, what if we could cut the price of games and really, or keep them the same at least? I think there are not enough entities involved that care. So ultimately it seems like fighting a losing battle. But the biggest thing to me is, like, how can people protect themselves from generative AI being like incorporated or ingested into that? And it's very similar to the argument I always make about the Renaissance art. You can't tell a computer what Renaissance art is. It has to see it, and it knows it, and it ingests it, and it looks at all of it. It understands the components that make AI or Renaissance art, and then it makes its own Renaissance art. But that's based off of a bunch of human creations that have been absorbed in a mechanized way. Because people, Jaffe always say, like, what's the difference between you and being inspired by Ayn Rand or something? It's like, well, that's not a mechanized thing. I didn't plug that into my ethos along with a million other things and just filter through it. It's a person being human. And I don't understand what people don't see about that, but I just don't think it matters to most people. And that's what disturbs me about the whole situation. Maybe it shouldn't. I don't know.
Well, and I think people are still grappling with it, right? Reasonably, we've only had a year with AI to even talk about these issues at all. 2023 was really the birth year of generative AI for the public. And so I think all of those feelings are justifiable. And I think that SAG-Aftra and actors involved in interactive media and other forms of media are justified in being concerned that the companies would replace them in a second if they could with this. So I think that the picket is justified. I think that the companies potentially fighting against that picket and strikes and everything else are justified because they do want to lower costs. But I agree with you that there is still a value to the human creative expression. And at some level, if you aren't giving the companies the library of materials, right? We're in a moment in time where the companies can cut out voice actors because they have decades of their performances that they could teach an AI on. If you don't have that, then you are potentially worried about getting AI that's just training on itself and ultimately becoming a copy of a copy of a copy. And then whatever the world looks like in that weird future is a problem for everybody. So I think they're justified in their picket. I think the law is ultimately going to determine that these LLMs and things that are based off of them are derivative works or using derivatives of intellectual property that people hold in a way that is probably going to be found to be illegal or infringing, and that will be its own kind of reckoning as to how these things operate. I am a better living through technology and chemistry and everything else kind of guy. So I am in favor of progress, but I do think that we run the risk of having creativity really drummed out of the system if we just let AI take over everything.
It's interesting too, because it just seems, again, it goes back to that idea of being inexorable to me, where as far as I understand, these AI models are largely siloed from each other, and even siloed from their versions, where they're like self-encapsulated, huge, obviously, operations, but where they could just exist in partitions even after they're made illegal or whatever. And I don't think that that's necessarily the answer. But what I'm saying is that, like, you can't put this toothpaste back into the tube. It just exists. It is what it is. And it is a lot like nuclear power, where it's just like, it is, you better just figure out how to use it, because here it is.
We're going to figure it out, and people are going to have different assortments of jobs in the populace. And I say this as someone who knows he's going to be directly affected by generative AI. And I've been working around variations of AI and smart contracts and other things in my line of work for years and years and years, and prepping to have different relationships with my clients and have a different functional kind of strategic importance to the representations that I make, because AI is going to be pretty good at doing one of my bread and butter tasks, which is analyzing a contract and looking for red flags and liabilities, right? Like an AI can do that in 2 seconds, something that is going to require me to bill an hour or more for. That's going to be a tough sell in the very, very near future, if not already today. And so I know that that's going to be a kind of disruptive influence. And yeah, you just have to figure out how to work around that. I don't have anybody to strike. I can't strike my clients on this kind of stuff. And that's unfortunate, as it is when the combustion engine starts and all of the people that had horses have a problem, right? Like, we have all these kinds of jump steps in industry that are unfortunate for any given person at any given moment in time. But I think overall, it will be of benefit to society.
Yeah, there's something to that. I'm caught up on that, about if that cycle, we talk about that cycle as if it's like illuminated manuscripts and then printed books and then pamphlets and newspapers, broadside. And I'm like, yeah, but is that forever? Or is there a time when it actually crosses some sort of boundary? And it feels like we're in that space now, but I can't articulate it, because you're right that this says there's been a creative destruction of many jobs and industries and sources of wealth and whatever over time. And I am obsessed with a lot of the really cool things I read about AI that could change the world. You know, one of the things I was listening to was talking about how AI could facilitate personalized, rapid drug tests. Like, you have cancer, and it can take like your genetic makeup and whatever's going on with you and then run 1 billion tests in a day with all these different meds and figure out exactly like what you need to, based on like what your body, how your body reacts. And then you could take that test basically every few days or whatever, as it caters and caters and caters and caters, bringing a form of immunity basically into existence. And it's amazing. And it's like, well, why wouldn't you want that? And then if you want that, why aren't you so protective of the jobs that could have discovered that? And to me, I'm like, I don't know. To me, I intuitively see the difference, but maybe there is no difference. And I'm protective of the things like the arts and the entertainment that I care about. I know Jaffe is very much, and I think John Garvin feels this way too, that like, who cares who makes the art? Is it good? And do you like it? And I'm like, I don't know that I like where that goes. I care deeply about who makes the art. It matters a lot. And it's uniquely human. The solution to the cancer problem is human in some sense, but it's actually chemical and biological, and it exists. You have to find it. You know, I don't know that a Renaissance painting is truth, but it exists.
I think your reaction is entirely justified with respect to creative pursuits. It is the nature of, it has to have soul, right? It has to have humanity within it. However you want to frame that is not necessarily captured by AI. And I do think people jump the gun a little bit on creative AI pursuits, whether it's writing a screenplay or some of the art that you see or videos on Twitter, because I don't see a world in which the AI is able to just exactly match what human beings are capable of creating. And I think there's always going to be a space for human creativity, whether or not that becomes the majority or the minority of creative pursuits in the future, right? The AI might make most of it, but there'll still be a space for artisanal art, if you will.
Sure.
And I think that will never stop. So I'm not as worried as some folks are. And this is a conversation we have at Hoeg House a lot, because my wife very much dislikes AI and creative pursuits. And she's a photographer. So she's in an artistic pursuit herself. But I overall think it's a good thing. I agree with you that it's inexorable. So there's only so much worth in fighting it on its whole. But I do think people that have a gut reaction to AI making creations are justified in that pursuit. And I do think that AI is most useful right now, certainly in kind of setting a framework and then having a human touch come in and change things, right? I like to use it for structural outlines or questions that I would want answered on a topic. I like it to pretend that it's an audience member and say, what things would you be concerned about with this story? And then say, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. But I hadn't even thought of that. Let's make that a part of my video. And that's not the AI writing my video, but I do find that to be a useful kind of pursuit that I bounce things off of with the AI.
Yeah, I can see that. It's obviously going to be a very potent tool. Already is. So we'll figure it out as we go. We have no choice. But yeah, that's all I have for today. I've kept you long enough, Hoeg. I appreciate you being here with me.
This was fun.
Yeah, it was. It was a great time. I'm glad that we were able to stack up some good things to talk about that, again, I don't feel like fit perfectly well on Sacred Symbols, or things that I don't think that Chris would really want to talk about either. But things that I would like to talk about. So I'm glad that you fielded them with me, and I appreciate you. What's going on with you for the rest of the day?
Oh, like I said, I'm looking forward to Concord. So I think that comes out this afternoon, as well as Gamescom. So I was going to watch some of that stuff and or play some games.
Cool.
I think I'm probably off the clock for work for the rest of the day, but you never know what the clients might have emailed me while I was recording this. Sure. So we'll see on that.
Cool, man. That sounds great. Yeah, it's like kind of cool. It's like only 75 and mostly cloudy. So I'm going to go out maybe gorgeous. For a walk or something, because it's nice. It's not horrible outside right now as it has been all summer, which is good. Hot's good, but I'm ready for the fall, ready for football and all the rest. It's here soon enough. I'm playing.
Let's go blue.
I'm sorry.
I said, let's go blue.
Yes. And I'm playing Ayuden Chronicle 100 Heroes. So I'm going to get back to that. I like it. It's really good. It's unabashedly Suikoden, but that's cool.
Yeah, it didn't work for me for whatever reason. I think I played an early version that had a big issue with the dead zone on the joystick. So my people would just take off, and it put a bad taste in my mouth when it came out, whenever that was, March, I want to say.
Yeah, March. I didn't know what to expect of it. I actually played the prequel and platinumed it first, which I wasn't into at all, really, but I just did the legwork. It's kind of cool, though, because some of the characters pop up in 100 Heroes.
I like Rising.
Yeah, Rising was, I would say, fine at best. But
I got to try 100 Heroes again at some point because it really just bounced off me. And it was one of the things I was most excited about this year. So that should be on my list.
Something very comfortable about it. But I'm only 10 hours or so in, so there's a lot more to do. But all right, Hoeg, we'll reconvene soon. I appreciate you taking the time again. Be well.
Absolutely.
And
you too.
All of you out there, be well. Appreciate you guys. All of your support. Patreon.com/laststandmedia and laststandmedia.store for merch. We'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye. Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Colin's Last Stand LLC, and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand's shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.